China has a deep criticism, and it's something the U.S. needs to deal with, actually, because it's partially a criticism I share. It doesn't believe that great powers should be intervening in other people's countries. I mean, I know that seems, again, that's deeply shocking to Americans. We love running around the world telling people what kind of toilet paper to use.
Hi there, welcome to another episode of Chinatown 2.0 podcast. I'm your host, Richard Yan. Sorry I've been away for a long time. I've been preoccupied with a few things, work namely. Now I'm back and we'll be releasing episodes regularly, 1 to 2 episodes each month. So today I'll be interviewing John Stevenson. He's a friend from college, Dartmouth, and he had an interesting path. He grew up home insecure, or homeless, to use the politically incorrect term, but later graduated valedictorian of his high school, went to Dartmouth, an elite university, and later enrolled and graduated from the Poli-Sci political science program at University of Chicago. So PhD of political science from Chicago. And he now owns a yoga studio, does contracts for various government agencies, including ones involved in national defense, and he has ambitions to run for governor of Maryland. So today we talked about, number one, his experience as a homeless person growing up. And by the way, he is Black American, so he would be adding his unique perspective from that particular angle as well. And his views of China from his vantage point, having worked in Washington, D.C., the state of Black politics, including his views on Black Lives Matter, his plans to run for office, and the reason for choosing Maryland at his home base. So I should point out that he has an elaborate plan and he has painstakingly thought through the design of his pathway towards the governor of Maryland. So this will become apparent as the conversation unfolds. And you will notice that in future conversations, including this one, we might deviate from China, Chinatown, or Chinese diaspora topics, mostly because I sometimes come across interesting people that I would like to interview on this show, but they don't necessarily fall into that particular category that we're familiar with from the previous shows. But since I am Chinese and I am concerned with Chinese diaspora issues, there will be from time to time. So even if we don't interview people from that particular cohort, we would still be touching upon these sorts of issues, most likely. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. John, welcome to Chinatown 2.0. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be invited. It is good to be joining.
So maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us the John 101, starting from wherever you feel comfortable.
It's sort of a funny story, self-narration. So usually at this point in our lives, when people say, who are you? We start with what do we do and how do we got there? And so I'll say that currently I'm a management consultant specializing in data science, data management, and data strategy for federal clients. But that's like my latest career. I'm a little bit of
and you're in Washington, D.C., right?
And I work, yes, technically, yeah, my client's located in Washington, D.C., but we're all teleworking, or not, people of a certain class are all teleworking now. And
Right.
I live in Baltimore, which is 35 miles away. Fun fact, Baltimore is as far away from Washington, D.C. as Dallas is from Fort Worth. Although Dallas and Fort Worth are one more of a city together than Baltimore and DC, they're kind of more satellites. So it's a fun fact. But yeah, so I'm working in the Washington, DC area. But I think that when I really think about like, who am I, what do I do? I kind of see myself as a bit of a Renaissance man. Like I try to do things that interest me, to learn new things. So for instance, like I'm also a yoga studio owner, which is fun during a pandemic, as well as a yoga teacher and practitioner. I enjoy data science. I actually find myself in a lot of like career and relationship coaching, sort of using the game theory that I learned and used to teach as a professor. There's just a lot of like random identities. I used to be a travel enthusiast, or I guess I am a travel enthusiast. I'm just home a lot now because of that's what one should be doing. Right. And a little bit of a political junkie. So that there's sort of like a lot of like random identities that get rolled together.
Right on. Well, we're looking forward to delving into each one of them. So I'd love to talk about your experience with politics now. And this isn't just a matter of you being in Washington, D.C., but offline, we've talked about how you have ambitions for a political career, and you've sort of designed your life around that particular ambition. So maybe just get us started on why you want to enter into politics, and maybe go into how you're moving your pieces in your life around to accommodate for that goal.
Well, one of the main reasons that I wanted to go into politics, I think that there is a general distrust of political institutions and a general sense that if political institutions are going to do something, they're not going to do something that helps you out.
Do you feel that's the case even prior to this pandemic in a significant way?
I think that's, I definitely believe that's the case. I think that, there's a couple of institutions in specific. So a lot of folks, are deeply concerned in different ways. They're deeply concerned about the revenue collection capacity of the United States. People believe that they pay more in taxes than they should, and the taxes are generally being, quote, wasted on things that they shouldn't be wasted on, right? That's just like a widespread general belief. There is also a deep distrust of local government to maintain basic infrastructure like roads, bridges, these sorts of things. And then, of course, there are the institutions of criminal processing and coercion, specifically the courts, the criminal systems, the jails, the police. Their deep distrust of these organizations, that they're promoting fair outcomes and that they're treating people equally under the law. So this kind of widespread distrust in public institutions and this widespread belief that we can no longer coordinate to do great things. This is why one day I will seek office with a couple of big goals, but one is making sure that there is more public healthcare capacity in general, just like coverage. There are lots of rural areas that don't have them. The second is that there's transportation choice. We assume that everyone has a car. We assume that everyone will need to drive to work, but we don't build things like telework infrastructure. We don't really invest in smart growth where we promote density to protect the environment. And of course, the third thing is that we spend a tremendous amount of money, a fair amount of resources, $1 billion in Chicago, $6 billion in New York City. We spend a tremendous amount of resources on policing that over time is achieving fewer of the outcomes that we'd want police to solve, like reducing the number of unsolved crimes or clearing something they call rape kits or deterring all sorts of things. Like by any number of metrics, funding goes up, but those basic outcomes are going backwards. So we want to have public safety that actually achieves the outcomes that we're looking for.
Okay, great. So I want to ask you about your political roadmap, but before going there, I do have a question that I wanted to ask that's not previously on the question list, and just feel free to, yeah, I know. So feel free to let me, this is an actual interview. It's not political theater. So, feel free to demur if that's not your area of expertise or you don't feel you're prepared for an answer. But a lot of what you're just saying, I feel, has a lot to do with what you do after you collect the revenues, right? So how do you not waste tax dollars? How do you distribute it to help folks in the country in a more efficient and equitable way? How do you train cops to be less racist and to basically do a better job at handling criminals and so forth? But I'm a little concerned about the part about actually getting the revenues in the first place. I'm referring to the relative competitiveness of the US in the world stage. So now there are narratives out there about how the US productivity and competitiveness might be decreasing over time due to various factors. And there's the rise of emerging economies, notably China, that's sort of taking away a lot of the US empire's productivity. Do you have any views on, just in general, what the situation is in terms of China usurping the US throne in terms of military strength, economic prowess, and so forth, and what US can do to help prevent that from happening?
Yes, so for better or for worse, I've spent more years of my life studying this question than I probably should have in my former academic roles. And I just want to say a couple things. Is one, so this is not going to be super popular. So obviously, if this turns out to be really unpopular, I never said it and you're fake news. But the truth is that over time, so China has actually accomplished a tremendous feat that I think is not completely appreciated in Washington, D.C., that within 2.5 generations, it has gone from a mostly agrarian, dispersed economy to a deeply urbanized, internationalized economy. Now, any place that that's happened, including the United States during the period of great American development, but also it happens currently in the United States as there are states that are, becoming more urbanized, like our population every decade is more urbanized than it was before. This creates a tremendous growth of a middle class. It creates a tremendous growth of real estate and assets. We're seeing this happen in Africa. We're seeing this happen in China. Now, you might say, what does that have to do with the price of mail? Well, the thing is that there's a point at which the U.S. shot up. But the U.S. and lots of other places, actually including North Africa, which was dismantled by the Europeans in the 1800s, but there are lots of places that shot up during their industrialization and early urbanization periods. We're witnessing China do that. And the thing is during that period of urbanization and de-agrarianization, you're going to see higher relative growth from the so-called weaker state, right? And I think that a lot of people in the United States are scared. They're like, oh, the United States is not growing as fast as China. China is literally, other than India, urbanizing the largest amount of people in the world. There's just going to be a tremendous economic growth that's going to happen irrespective of anything. So I'm actually one of those people that thinks that the world is better off. Now we have to deal with pollution and stuff, but the world is better off when people are meeting basic services. China has in 2 generations done a remarkable transformation of moving millions, if not billions of people out of poverty. And those are just facts that we should be all very happy about. And so I don't actually see this as an economic problem for the US. I see this as something that's very natural. The US creating an international economy that allows for this kind of investment is a good thing. And we have a lot of evidence, at least through the mid-Hu Jintao period, that this general economic engagement is something that China actually supports, a whole stop. I think you can sort of get more complicated about current politics and what's going on, but there's also a massive international virus. And so it's not clear, there's a lot happening. But just in general, we see the story, at least of our lifetimes, is the story of an international economy that China is trying to shape and participate in. Obviously, it has an outside impact on its neighbors, but we trade a lot with Mexico. China's going to trade a lot with Vietnam. This isn't shocking stuff. So I would say on the economic front, I think it's fine. China has a deep criticism, and it's something the U.S. needs to deal with, actually, because it's partially a criticism I share. It doesn't believe that great powers should be intervening in other people's countries. I mean, I know that seems, again, that's deeply shocking to Americans. We love running around the world telling people what kind of toilet paper to use. But that is there are lots of countries out there that are deeply critical of that. I see this as being an important part of a vigorous process of what defines the international order, who should be using force, when is force across borders justified. China generally believes that force across borders is not justified. It just doesn't always agree with people about what its borders are, right? And that is actually a problem for the United States and China to kind of figure out, including parts of China / parts of contested China that include Tibet and some of the border with India, some of the things in, there's I used to know the name of it, but there's these sort of 3 circles of maritime power. So these are just normal kind of give and take. The United States has a Monroe Doctrine, right? So China has a version of it. So these are things for me that are very normal and nothing to be alarmed by.
Okay, great. I don't think that's a very controversial answer, by the way.
It actually is. There are a lot of people who believe that Chinese growth is all secretly military power, because China's doing the normal things. You grow a little bit. They're starting to police piracy in their waters. 25 years ago, China could not project power into its territorial waters, at least mainland China. I mean, if China had the Navy today that it had, or 50 years ago that it has today, there would not be Taiwan. But literally, when the Gov't government fled across that strait, China didn't literally not have the ability to follow them, right? This is not true today, obviously, but so little things like the growth of military or the naval power, the ability to potentially harass and do offshore drilling in places like Vietnam. A lot of folks are oh my God, this is aggression. But any country that expands, right? Even Ethiopia and Somalia fight wars about their borders. This is just normal. It's not threatening the world. And more specifically, every time the US had an opportunity to grow and urbanize, we pretty much invaded one of our neighbors and forced them to our will. China's not doing that. It lives in a different international system than the one we did. But it is actually, a lot of people consider growth by China to be dangerous just by fiat, because many people who make policies still believe the safest China is a China that can't do anything. China through the 1990s was still a net recipient of foreign aid. Now it's giving a lot of foreign aid to countries. And that for a lot of people is threatening because it's not the China they grew up with, who was like weak and like, quote, begging for handouts. It's a proud China that has its own view of the world, that wants people to go to its universities. They want to have their students spread Chinese culture. And some people consider that dangerous. And I don't happen to, but it is very frightening for a lot of people.
Okay. So I want to say a couple of things. So you and I went to the same university. I have a feeling that most of the kids, I wouldn't say everyone, but most of the kids that went to our school and took classes from our government department would probably hold some view of China similarly to you. I don't know if I'm correct. But then my first question is, do you confirm that understanding? And my second question is, what you describe as something that might receive criticism on, are you suggesting that the mainstream thought in DC or the political elite class, for example, basically believes in this a rising China is dangerous sort of rhetoric?
So I'm going to be very careful in how I answer this question, because I have had, I've been in a lot of rooms, but I will say that there are many people out there. I don't know. I won't say how close they are or not to power, but there is at least a consensus in the Beltway area, particularly among people who consider themselves China experts, that China, at every chance it's getting, is trying to undermine something called American influence. And we can get into that and what that might mean. I think you're right. People of our generation don't fear this, but I remember this is something I'm at liberty to talk about. Years ago, I think it was like 2012, 2013 at this point, I was a part of an international exchange program amongst people who were getting PhDs in political science. We were doing a kind of cooperative approach to security studies with Chinese scholars. And so we got to hang out in Beijing. It was great. It's fantastic. Loved it. Great street food. But I was there, but it was a very stark generational divide. There were a lot of people who had gotten their PhDs during the Cold War that were like aggressively saying, China's
generational divide among the Americans that got exchanged.
Among the Americans that were there. And it was harder, and then I don't want to come across as insensitive. It was harder for me to read the older Chinese scholars who participated, just because like Americans were deeply comfortable having loud shouting arguments about who was doing what. And I found our counterparts to be a little bit more reserved and respectful. But again, I'm not trying to play into any stereotypes. It's just, there was like a level of passion from the American scholars. I found that the Chinese scholars were much more like dispassionate and a little bit more stick to the facts. And so I was having a hard time reading a generational divide there. And I'm also kind of like myself, like I disagree with the people who are with me, whereas I don't think my counterparts who are of my generation would so publicly disagree with their mentors. So there was just a lot going on in that situation. But I will say that the Cold Warriors were deeply concerned about like the decline of American power. And when I shared this urbanization thesis, people agreed on the facts, but they're like, but China won't stop. And I was like, but what does that mean? And again, it's just the evidence I've seen. If you look at American nuclear foreign policy doctrines, for a long time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we had kind of a first strike approach to nuclear deterrence, which would mean we called it massive retaliation. But the basic idea is that if the Soviet Union overran Eastern Europe, we had committed to using our nukes to turn them back. China, as many people know, developed nuclear weapons in the 1960s and 1970s, but China has a doctrine that literally no other country in the world has, which is called minimal deterrence. And this is just one example of how Chinese foreign policy is like very different. And I think this is why Americans shouldn't be scared.
Minimal deterrence basically means, if you want to have your nuclear weapon, we aren't going to stop you. Is that what you're saying?
No, so in this case, minimal deterrence means China has enough nuclear weapons that it could retaliate for a second strike, but it doesn't build one weapon after that. Whereas the United States and the Soviet Union, as you may know, had a whole arms race that actually still is kind of going on. And there's some evidence that the United States is actually pursuing nuclear primacy. This again is all in the public domain, not using any classified knowledge, which in nuclear primacy means that we could, in theory, nuke another country, take out its nukes, and still have nukes left to take out other countries. China literally has built the minimum number of nukes ever, and it has not increased or changed its stockpile in almost 30 years. It has whole academic articles about it. It has forsworn the use of nuclear weapons first. So there's a lot of things where, like, even when China looks like a great power, it has whole doctrines about non-intervention, not necessarily non-aggression or like, you know, shamefulness or anything, but it's like very much like we will respect borders. Again, there are disagreements about what constitutes a border. I don't want to paper over those, but like China has never consistently believed that they needed to go into another country and tell that country how to behave. The only exception was during the revolutionary period in Korea. Obviously, the Korean War was China and America were kind of on opposite sides. But basically, since the Korean War, China has largely kept its troops within its borders. That's not the American approach to foreign policy.
So to follow up on the point about feeling threatened about a rising China, do you think one legitimate argument could be that the Americans are concerned with the government system in China, in that very few people wield most of the power, and when a country is that democratically governed, there are arguments to be made that things could go hugely awry as a result of the whims of just a very few people. As I'm saying that, I kind of don't know if I'm talking about U.S. or America.
Yeah, no, this is the gag, right? And this is also why, like, you know, I don't want you to push me into a corner where I say something crazy, but I have pointed out many times to many people that at the local level, not necessarily at the federal level, China is in some ways more democratic at the local level than the United States is. Many places in the United States are in one-party rule. They're functionally in police states just because the police and the mayors. Yeah, like at least, I mean, like, there isn't a Republican Party in Chicago. Now, I don't think the Democrats are the worst thing in Chicago, but there's just not a Republican Party. But the ruling party of Chicago is also in cahoots with the Chicago police. So there are lots of citizens who otherwise are good Democrats at the national level that also feel terrorized. That's just one example. But the thing is, you could replicate this over and over again, whether people are having access to clean water, whether people feel like they're represented at the courts, whether, you know, there's just all sorts of things that can go on. And that's a laundry list that I could like be on the soapbox. So, you know, the deep irony is that China is authoritarian, but like it's less authoritarian than Singapore. You know, like if you want the most authoritarian country in the world, it's like Zimbabwe and Singapore. It's just, these are very awkward places. Maybe Equatorial New Guinea, but that's a different story.
So why is Singapore more authoritarian than China? I actually don't know.
Singapore's one-party state is like amazing. Like if you love the idea of like deeply stable politics that are like deeply anti-democratic, they have muzzled their press more or less. They have a capitalist system that they have perfect control over. And like anyone who has ever threatened the Singapore government, and I'm thinking the founder I used to know. See, I used to know this stuff. This is like what I used to study.
Lee Kuan Yew?
Lee Kuan Yew. That's right. Lee Kuan Yew. Thank you. Like the party system that he set up, and I'll get into this in a second. The party system that he set up was good at co-opting anyone before they could become a problem. And like the people who are most disenfranchised in Singapore happen to be these laboring classes that live in like these barracks. That also happens to be the people. They're mostly ethnic minorities, Malays and other things, who live in these barracks. They mostly caught COVID. Like they're completely disenfranchised. Everyone else has been either co-opted or bought off by the Singaporean system. It's a city state, so it's a little easier to do. China does have quote unquote one party rule, but how the party, and under the current government, it has become more centralized and more personalized than it has been at any time in the past since arguably Mao Zedong. Again, that could be a little controversial among Chinese scholars, so I don't want to go too far at that because that is technically not my expertise. But generally, the party decides in China, and there's robust mechanisms within the party to make sure that there was rotation of power, that different provinces were recognized, that people have passed up, people have passed down. Ever since the Cultural Revolution, there's actually been a lot of check on sort of the mobilization of paramilitaries. These are all classic problems that lots of authoritarian states in places like Africa still deal with. China has largely solved the problems of instability that come from one party rule. These, again, this is different from, say, the instability that would be in a place like Iraq under Saddam Hussein, where there was a much more personalized military rule kind of thing going on, right? So even authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes are different. At the national level, the United States is obviously electorally competitive in a way that China is not. Like the selection process for who becomes the national leader is cloaked. But when we actually look down at the local levels, there's like local village democracy. There's a lot of robust participation in places in China. Even the cities and the way they're built are kind of much more informed by robust citizen participation. It just doesn't translate up. Whereas the United States has a very vigorous federal system that has deep parts that are deeply locally authoritarian and dominating. Whether it's like one party rule, whether it's the police working with each other. You have whole states that, like, for instance, there's this whole thing like, can the Democrats win enough in Texas? Because since 2003, one party has ruled the entire state from the state government down to the local level, except in like small patches. We also know, and this is sort of previewing a little bit of the racial politics, almost every place where there's a large Black majority, there's a deeply white nationalist government, usually under the Republican Party, that has run the government basically since the early 20th century, right? And so this is just the reality that, like, yes, we can vote for president. Yes, we have elections, but like there are whole places where like the opposition party can't win. Again, political scientists, when we study other countries, we don't call that democracy.
Yeah.
In the US, of course, we can't talk about it that way. But when you talk about other countries, we're a little bit more honest about these things.
Okay. So the last point you actually mentioned, I'm a little bit surprised about. You mentioned how there are certain areas in the States where there are heavy Black populations, and somehow the ruling class in those states happen to be white nationalists. Can you give some examples?
Yes. So it is mostly the former Confederacy. So the story of the Midwest is a little different, but this is mostly the former Confederacy, places like South Carolina, places like Northern Florida, places like Mississippi, to a lesser extent, Kentucky, Arkansas. These are just places that historically have very large Black populations.
Right.
In fact,
well, there was a time when there was a massive migration from the South to the North because the shortage of labor and just the interest in getting Black folks to work in the North, right? So, I mean, obviously not everyone left. And you're saying, I really am very ignorant on this aspect. So you're saying there are really still heavy concentration of Black population in those areas that you mentioned.
Yes, they're just not as large as they used to be. And some of this migration that started, like for instance, North Carolina used to have a majority Black population. And the post-Reconstruction governments, white nationalists, who at the time were Democrats, that's sort of switched in a lot of ways for a lot of reasons, chased out people, right? And like drove them to all sorts of places. And of course, there were, as you mentioned, these economic forces that drove, especially into like the rail yards of Chicago, the factories of Detroit, to a lesser extent, the seaports of Boston, pulled in Black laborers. That was largely not as true on the West Coast. Those were mostly Chinese laborers for a variety of reasons, different stories, as you know, but like that also happened, but it's not like every Black person left, right? It's just, there were just so many that now that they're like all these pockets of like places that Black people live, generally urbanized, but there's still a lot of very rural and semi-rural African-American populations that live across the traditional South.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we're going to get back to this point later on. So maybe tell us just a little bit about yourself. Give us the lens of how you grew up as an African-American in America.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And actually, I don't get to talk about it as much as I like generally, but most people can't guess from my accent, but I'm actually from Louisiana, though where I'm from depends on who I'm talking to, because I've lived lots of places. But I grew up in Louisiana and Texas. In Louisiana,
so do you speak with a different accent when speaking with relatives back home?
No, so they all have Southern accents. I lost mine when I went to boarding school. And that's one of those times where, I lived in, I was in boarding school for 5 years. So there's a way in which I'm from Philadelphia. And then, like you, I lived in New Hampshire for 4 years. And so sometimes I talk about my New England roots. And then I lived in Chicago for 9 years. And so I've got that Midwest And then I've lived in the DC area now for 5 years. And so there's like different stories based on who I am. And my family moved in early 2000s from the Louisiana, Texas area to the Boston area. So like when I go home, I go to Boston. Yeah. I did not technically grow up there. So there's just like that scattering. But
okay, well,
no,
talk about where you're originally from. So Louisiana.
Yeah, so I'm from Louisiana and to a lesser extent Texas. So, just classic, there's a joke. So like African or Black peoples in the United States actually have a lot of diversity in terms of where they're from. There's like people from more Caribbean styles. So you're thinking you're Haitians, you're Jamaicans. There's actually people now from Africa who come here. There's some interesting stories about Caribbeans, Africans, and people from the US who are like descendants of slaves. That's a whole thing. But because other types of Black people have like, they could be like Nigerian and Kenyan or like Caribbean, there's a joke in the Black community where it's like, I'm mac and cheese Black, just like plain
I never heard
from
that.
The South. Yeah, no, it's definitely an inside joke. So I'm like sharing it with you and your audience.
So are you?
Yeah, so
is that what you're saying you are?
Yeah. So like, my family, like my grandfather was a sharecropper. His grandfather was enslaved. Like our lineage, like we can't go beyond slavery because we just don't know, but like we can trace our lineage through slavery, in Mississippi and Louisiana. And so like I'm part of that class of African Americans that has, at least in their family, people like now all my grandparents are dead. They are dead. So I don't know anyone anymore who knew someone who was enslaved. So like my grandfather knew people who were enslaved, but he passed. So now I'm like, if I have kids, they won't know anyone who knew someone that was enslaved, but we're like literally just getting to the point where there will be a generation of people who didn't know someone who knew someone that was enslaved, right? So that's sort of where we are in my family history.
By the way, so the very fact that your complexion isn't exactly the same as someone that just came from Nigeria or Kenya, is that a matter of there's basically slave owners in your blood somewhere?
So I'm sure there are. However, people are often very surprised. So I also did a lot of field research in Nigeria. People are very surprised to discover there are actually lots of light-skinned people who live in places like Nigeria. So the complexion of Black people is not necessarily a feature of the amount of non-Black blood in their bloodline. Like the complexion just seems to vary, even in places where you wouldn't traditionally think that there's a mixing. Now, there are, of course, lots of people in the United States that do have multiracial heritage. So I'm not in any way discounting that, but the complexion is not as straightforward as you think.
Okay, but as far as you know, though, in terms of the reverse family tree that you can see, everyone's Black, right?
Yes, everyone's Black.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, and I'm not saying that there hasn't, maybe some rape occurred in the past. Maybe there were interracial marriages, and like my sister was really into like doing that whole DNA thing. So I know that, even my own DNA is it's like, there's like 8% not African American, right? Or not African technically, right? And that's like a little bit of everything. But so
does the skin color change over time though, by the way? Like as you get older, do you get fairer? Do you get darker?
Not that I know of. I mean, I think I was gonna say, I think maybe some babies have slightly different complexions, but no, I think it's like relatively like, I tan, obviously, so I can get darker, and if I like stay indoors all the time, I get slightly lighter.
Yeah. I actually did not know that about Black people getting tan. That's interesting. Do you apply sunscreen and stuff?
I mean, we're supposed to, right? Some people in my family are more religious. I do it about half the time, honestly, and that's just because I'm lazy. That has nothing to do with like it. Just sometimes I forget. Oh, I'm under this giant UV lamp.
Okay.
Outside.
Got it. Okay, so let's move on. So you were born in Louisiana, and so what did your parents do?
So first of all, my parents did get divorced when I was very young, like 4 or 5, but they had jobs that were very typical of the times of the 80s and 90s. My mother was like a technology specialist, but what that meant for Black women at the time is that there was a lot of typing, a lot of what we would consider office management now. Later that evolved into things like purchasing and operations, but the jobs available to Black women, even with college educations, she wasn't really allowed in like the computer room. So it didn't become coding. It was a lot of typing and that kind of stuff.
Was there still Jim Crow at that time, or are you just talking about these implicit biases now?
So funny enough, the elementary school of course Jim Crow was officially over in the 60s, but the
Yeah.
elementary school that I went to was still fighting court-ordered desegregation orders at the public school when I was in public school. So like, yeah, a lot of this stuff happened in the 60s, but then it has to be worked out in the lower courts.
Wait, hold on.
And there
So
was
they were
still,
fighting desegregation in the sense that you were already attending that school. So it was a all black school and it did not want
it was
whites in?
it was a mixed school, but there were like 5 Black people who were being actively sued by the local government to like push us back out.
The school is suing the people sending the kids to the school to try to
Right.
get
They were
them
saying that we drew the
kicked
lines
out.
and not we. So like, of course, public schools are based on where you live.
Yeah.
Because of court-ordered desegregation, they had to move the lines because there's so much racial segregation that if
Right.
you move the lines, that allows different people to access. And the local people were fighting the movement of the line, suggesting that it needed to be somewhere else. And
Yeah.
that basically would not have allowed any Black people to come. But because the line was still under contest and we just went to school, we were technically, because you can actually be sued for sending, like parents are currently sued today, right? Like even if they're homeless, they have to show jurisdiction to be able to send their kids to school. It is actually a crime, like an actual crime on the books, to send a kid to a public school if you don't live in the jurisdiction. So that was what was being played on. Like the actual people were being sued as parents, even though they were also told this is where your kid was assigned. So there's just, I mean, this is just very, like when I say there's not trust in public institutions,
in your
that's what I'm
case,
talking about.
right, I see. But in your case, did you live within the right zone?
The right zone that was contested.
Okay, I see. That was under contestant, contest. So theoretically, you could have been sued too.
Yes, theoretically.
Okay, but I guess they sued 5 other Black people instead of you guys.
Well, I mean, we probably were sued. Like, I mean, I was a little kid, so I wasn't like sitting in the courtroom.
Oh,
I mean, I
see.
did have to answer some questions from officers, like not infrequently. That's a whole different story. But like, no, I mean, like, so if you're thinking about it as a legal strategy, right? Like, let's just take people out of it for a second, right? If you want to prevent desegregation, you have kind of a few paths. One is like you could just start terrorizing people, but that was even by the 80s that was getting awkward, right? You could do it. Yeah. You could probably have gotten away with it 10 years before. By the 80s, it's getting a little awkward. But remember, David Duke, who is a noted KKK member, yeah, he was running for Senate around this time. Like this is that era. This is the 80s, right? It's not. I'm not that young. I'm not that old. But this is the 80s, right? So it's not like that long ago, but it wasn't like, So David Duke is doing his thing at the time. So this is actually what's happening at the state level. At the local level, right? So you're thinking about what are your strategies? The first thing is to say that, hey, the way the line was redrawn was incorrect. So you're just trying to say, technically, we can't yet admit people because you did it incorrectly, right? So that was one strategy that was happening. My family obviously was that was the school we were assigned to. So the legal strategy against sort of me being assigned to that school was to try to say that we needed a judge to issue a stay so that people couldn't send their schools while we were figuring out where the line was. That's a classic, like, let's just keep kicking the can down the road. Now, luckily, the courts sort of more or less dodged that issue, but that was strategy one. Strategy two, of course, is you try to change the committee that wrote that changes the lines, but that takes time, that takes elections. And of course, strategy three is you start trying to threaten people who go to the school with legal repercussions if they don't do it. And they, like most people, they're pursuing an all the above strategy, right? And like these grievances, this like local contest is one of the reasons David Duke was like running. Like he's like, hey, they're forcing us every which way, like they're making us do things we don't have to do. Like you didn't do anything, you didn't move, you didn't let these people in your neighborhood. Why are they in schools with your kids? So that was what was happening, kind of like, and if you're thinking about it as like a political strategy, it's an all the above, right? It wasn't, quote, personal. They didn't hate, quote, me. They just didn't want folks like me in their schools, and they were trying to do everything they could to disappear that under the normal rules that used to obtain.
Okay.
Is that making sense?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. Thanks for that comprehensive analysis. So I have so many follow-up questions. Number one,
wait, I'm just in elementary school. I haven't even gotten any older yet.
Yeah. The beginning of the ordeal. So the elementary school that you went to, what is the percentage breakdown for Black folks?
Ooh, now I don't know.
No. Back then.
Back then, it was very small. Okay. I mean, like I wasn't counting back then, but there weren't that many people. I saw, again, relative to the local segregation, Like
Yeah.
I didn't see that many black people, and I saw a lot of white people. Is that 5%? Is that 10%? Was it 20? I don't know, but it wasn't like majority, which is
Yeah.
like what I was used to growing up. Like my church was all black, you know what I mean? Like, so it
Sure,
was
sure,
like
sure.
something less than
Did you
80%.
have any white friends at the school?
I did actually. I had my first white friend at that school. His name was Lane. I remember him fondly.
Yeah. So what was it like? Like, was he like, man, can you see how crazy this is? They won't let you guys in? Or like, how did that
So
work?
it's like, I don't know, like as kids, I don't think we
You were very
we didn't
conscious
know
about
what
that,
was,
right?
yeah, like, cause I mean, you have to think about like kids, they
Yeah.
always say kids have to be taught to hate. We didn't know that we were going to be enemies. Does that make sense? Like we were just,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we were catching bullfrogs, hanging out in school. You know what I mean? Like we didn't know
You're like
enough.
the tiger and the lamb that grow up together. You see those videos?
Yeah, we obviously weren't going to each other's houses. You know what I mean? There were some of the things that if I thought about it, there were friends. I went over their houses. I didn't go over Lane's house. You know what I mean? There were lots of things like that. But like, it wasn't in my mind, like Lane is different, you know, like it just,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, actually I did. I noticed he was different. He had green eyes, which I thought was weird. I thought that was the weirdest thing ever. As a little kid, I thought that was weird, but it wasn't
Right.
like, oh, this is a white person, you know, it's just, that's
Yeah.
not what I was thinking, but,
Understood. Okay.
and everyone had a Southern accent. So it's not like people talk differently. You know what I mean? Like we were all in Louisiana. We were all growing up in that culture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the very fact that you guys weren't conscious about it also speaks to the universality of humanity, isn't it? Like if no
Yes.
one were to bring that up, you would never have noticed, oh, we're actually of different races. It's just more that we had different complexions or we just had different appearances or maybe different
So
traditions at home.
I do want to push back a little bit. So
Yeah.
that's not an illogical conclusion, but I actually think that even if no one had told us, the truth is, as long as the rest of society was organized along those lines. So think about it this way, right? Just in terms of how I lived my life, right? I didn't go to church with Lane. He was never invited to my house. I was never invited to his house. So even if no one had told us to hate each other, we could
Yeah.
have grown up just realizing our worlds were different, and nobody had to say a thing. Just society was organized in a way. And I mean, and this is actually in some ways the beauty of residential segregation. You don't need someone standing in the door yelling the N-word. You don't. You
Yeah.
just need someone who you don't know that there's a room that you could be in. You don't have access to a school that you didn't know you could go to. You're not invited to play with people. You know, it's that. So even if no one had told us, I think we would have realized it eventually, right? And even people our age, you know, just to bring it home a little bit, this isn't just happening in the 80s. There are a lot of my friends, some of whom are white, some of whom are not. We are fortunately, because of our background, we're almost all middle class now. And there are people making choices as they have kids to move to economically and racially homogenous suburbs and parts of cities. And the thing is these are all good liberals. You know, they voted for Barack Obama twice, as they say, you know.
Yeah.
But the truth is their kids are actually going to grow up under hyper segregation. Their kids are going to grow up around other rich people, and they're going to probably be the kind of white people who think, what's wrong with black people? How can I help them? And nobody has to tell them this. They're just going to grow up in a world
Right.
where all the doctors are white, all the teachers are white, all the presidents are white. You know, it's just not like no one has to tell you. You just sort of see it. And so I think that's why I want to say I agree with you. There's some prejudice, but like it's just the way things are. White people are in charge, non-white people are not, and that's what you've seen your whole life, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I think I was, yeah. So I agree with that, right? I was actually, I think, sort of broadly referring to the fact that if there isn't this sort of social construct around us that basically say black people tend to live a certain way and white people tend to live a certain way, if you just let you and Lane grow up and in a completely mixed society, I don't think there's any point where there will be an inherent discrepancy, right, between the two of you. So okay, so elementary school. So, but your parents. So you mentioned that your parents were divorced when you were very young. So who did you live with?
Mom, mostly, though that's going to be a fun story in a second.
Okay.
So my dad, I did want to say, so my dad was at the time very common labor category for dad was that, you know, first of all, my grandfather had a ranch, a farm, so we like worked on the farm a little bit. It was his pride and joy because he was a sharecropper who actually beat the system and was able to actually
Became
pay
a property
for.
owner. Wow.
Correct. And I'm sure you know enough about sharecropping to know that it's basically mathematically hard to do it because of the way they structure loans and interest. And he was able to like save enough and beat the system. Right.
Yeah,
That was
I actually
he was
wasn't
very,
aware, but I can imagine how the system is set up such that it's very difficult to become a property owner. It's like you were a tenant and now you want to buy the property.
exactly. But you have to buy the property using crops. But in order to get the crops, you need the forward financing. The forward financing carries interest. It eats up most of your money. So the other reason I talk about this is my grandfather was extremely proud that he beat the system, right? He was,
He should
and
be.
like, yeah, and no, and like, obviously he was of an age that like, it's not like he went to a good school. Like they didn't have a lot of great public education back then when he was growing up. So he was just like, this was his pride and joy. So I heard a lot about the ranch. He was just so excited about it. But my father worked, I don't want to say as a manual laborer, but there was a lot of like fixing cars and a lot
His
of like
grandfather on your dad's side?
janitorial work. My dad. Yeah, it was my dad's
Paternal
father.
grandfather. Yeah.
Yeah, paternal grandfather. But my dad himself was much more like hands-on fixing cars, like a lot of like skills, so to speak. Like it would be, I'm trying to think, trade labor. That's what it's called, trade. He did a lot of trade skills. So that was his. But this was, of course, one of the reasons that my parents got divorced. My mom is a big fan, even today. You know, her birthday was on Saturday. I called her. And, one of the things she's really excited about is she just figured out some new trick. She's really into Oracle database management right now, right? And that's like, she's training herself to be better at Oracle database management. And this is, we were talking about robotic process automation because she's like, I keep doing all these tasks, but I feel like these should be automated. But like, that's what my mom talks about. That is not at all what my dad and I talk about ever. Like that is not, my dad just doesn't live in that world, but my mom was really trying to be a part of the knowledge economy. My dad does not. My dad was like, he's like, I don't trust white people. Why are you working in their offices? What do you mean computers are going to be big? We can't even afford a computer, but we know there are always going to be cars. It's just classic. Like you can imagine any two people disagreeing about what their future will look like. And that just pulled them apart because my mom is like, we need to prepare kids for the information economy. And my dad is like, we can't risk gambling on things that we don't know aren't going to exist. We know that these things are going to exist and we know that we have them now. And so they've lived very different lives, but that ultimately pulled them apart. Just no shared vision for the future. It's why lots of marriages fall apart. Okay. So I lived with my mom and that was fun. And, we ended up moving to Texas for a while. As it turns out, about 4% of Louisiana's population did in the 90s because Texas economy was booming and Louisiana's was not. The most interesting thing, and I think this has really shaped me in terms of being a political activist, is there was in fact a wage slowdown. And my mom, like many women of her age, again, we even saw this being reflected in the late Justice Ginsburg, she just hit a ceiling where she couldn't be promoted. And that, unfortunately, because she was also a woman, she was making less than a man would have. And she was, of course, supporting a family with one income and not two. So it basically got to the point where housing costs exceeded the amount that she was bringing in by her salary income. And that despite having a full-time job, actually 2.5 full-time jobs, she was, for about 6 years of my childhood, though not consecutively, we were in fact homeless, or what we now call housing insecure, because we just couldn't afford it.
Hold on. A couple questions. Number one is your dad didn't pay alimony. Number two is you mentioned that your mother had 2.5 full-time jobs. So who was taking care of you? And number three is, did you have any siblings?
Yes. So we can go backwards. 3 siblings. Yeah. I'm the oldest. Okay. Thank God. And because being the oldest is the best. Okay. Number two, so technically it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing about race and class in the United States. Poor people don't pay alimony. Alimony is tax deductible. Poor people pay child support. And some child support occurred. It did occur. But I think it is hard to overstate, because it wasn't really the 90s until they really started like pushing up the minimum wage and stuff. It is hard to overstate how the cost of housing and transportation outstripped the cost of what people were bringing in. Even if we had 2 people earning full capacity, I think we would have been lucky, just given the wages in the South at the time. This is just very typical of the geographies they lived in. In today's money, they'd be worth about $42,000 to $43,000. And I often watch in disbelief, honestly, and that's the bubble I live in now. But I watched these videos about these couples where like the two of them together are making 48,000, right? Remember the median income in America is 50, right? So there's like half of people are making less. So I know it sounds weird to say, how could you have two people making so little? But in the South, which again is still true today, wages are lower and there are all sorts of costs that are higher, like owning a car. There's not as much public transportation. Like there's just no way to offload these costs. And like many people of all races, like my family fell prey to those rising costs. And there was a limit on how much my mom could progress in any given career because of like biases against women in the 90s, but also biases against Black people, and of course, specifically biases against Black women.
What is the difference between alimony and child support?
Alimony, I mean, so both of them are spousal support payment types, but it's just they have different tax classifications. And so rich people get to have alimony, which is tax deductible.
Wait, so if your income is below a certain level, then the alimony that you pay will be called child support and won't be tax deductible?
Oh, I think it's just the way the lawyers and courts structure things. I think that people with better lawyers get alimony payments. It's been a while since I read an interesting academic article on that.
Okay. But who is taking care of the 3 kids when your mom had 2.5 full-time jobs?
So we took care of each other. We also were, with our grandparents. Like there's another great sociological article called "Why Do White People Have So Few Cousins?" So like in the South, it's very common. And I think I actually feel like this is actually true of a lot of immigrant families. Everybody has a cousin and an uncle and a grandparent. And we just had a wide ranging network, not enough of a network to support stable housing for everybody, but we had enough of a network that like people didn't starve, we were able to eat together, these kinds of things. So we, like many people, relied on the strength of our kin network to help us.
Okay, so when your mom moved from Louisiana to Texas, lots of other family members moved together?
So in that case, luckily, thank God, we were all very born again Christians. So we, although some of the homeless period coincided with Texas, most of it occurred in Louisiana, where we did have family. But that was like one of the reasons she moved to Texas is like, hey, if you've been housing insecure for 3 years, my mom is of the belief, if you've tried with the jobs you have, you need to be willing to put everything on the table. Now, this was deeply controversial in our family. People didn't move because you want to be around family. It was important. Family is very important. But my mom is like these jobs aren't paying me enough. I have 2 jobs and I work a side job. Like I can't actually afford housing. Not great housing. We're not talking mansions. We're talking like public housing. And so her mind was like, it was better to move to Texas where she had the possibility of a career. And it was actually one of the biggest raises she got in her life. It was like a 38% raise. It was better. And we had housing there. Good housing, actually. It was for her, it was better to like leave family behind and like in the pursuit of economic opportunity than to like scrape by, right? And so that was one of the reasons we ended up moving.
So how old were you when you moved to Texas?
13, maybe 12 or 13, one of those.
Okay, got it. All right, so you had sort of support from people outside the nuclear, relatives outside the nuclear family when you were in Louisiana, but then your mom went to the Lone Star State, sort of alone, with taking the 3 kids with her.
4. There were 4 of us, 3 in addition to me.
Oh, I see. So 3 siblings. Got it. Wow. So herself with 4 children. Then at that point, you were already a teenager, but your youngest sibling was how much younger than you?
He would be 6. Or sorry, she would have been 4.
She would have been 4.
Yeah, my brother is 6 years younger than me. My youngest sister is 8 years younger than me.
So, okay. But somebody still had to watch these kids though, right? Basically, would the nannying responsibility fall on your shoulders as the eldest?
There are 2 of us, and my other sister's just 2 years younger than me. So we, 10 and 12, ruled the roost. I mean, that's how I became a great cook. I had to learn to cook for the family and all these sorts of things, right?
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, it is not uncommon, and again, this is very true of families that grow up impoverished. It's a kind of all hands on deck situation. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
no, I get it. But the 4-year-old, where did she go to school? Did she go to a daycare? Did you guys have someone come in the family and help out? Because you had to go to school. You can't be home all day watching her.
No, we definitely went to school. We read. We went to school.
But the 4-year-old went to a daycare then?
Now you're testing my memory. That's a good question. So I remember O'Neill, I mean, she was somewhere. She wasn't like in the street.
Yeah,
But like, I do remember daycare. I remember daycare. I remember I was in daycare, but I think that was in Louisiana.
yeah.
She probably was in daycare at some point.
No, I'm saying,
Like,
yeah. Where
but
was
we
she when you were
watched each other.
13 years old?
So this is where it gets tricky because we did watch each other, but then part of the plan was we had to get fewer people in the household. That's when I got shipped off to boarding school.
Wow. Okay. This is surprising. I mean, aren't boarding schools expensive? So how do you square that with the fact that you guys were so impoverished that you were considered home insecure?
So you might be surprised to know I'm very charming. I charmed my way into a scholarship.
Right. That's understandable. But okay, so a full ride then it must have been, right?
It
So
was
basically,
literally because we could barely afford the plane.
yeah.
Like, we tried to buy a plane ticket and unfortunately it bounced. So one of the times when I was actually going to school, we had to drive across the country to get me there because the check did not clear to fly on.
Where was this, by the way? What state was this?
Outside of Philadelphia. It was in a place called Exton, PA.
Okay.
It's on the main line. It's near Philly.
Right. So hold on, but rewind just a little bit. So you guys moved to Louisiana, and then how old were you when you went off to Pennsylvania?
I was like 12 or 13. I was in 8th grade. 8th grade is when I started.
Got it. Okay.
So this is 1996. Like if you want like a calendar year, it's like 1996.
Right. What do you think got you that scholarship? Was it the grades? I mean, you mentioned being charming, right? But that,
I actually was also like really good. I was very bright, scored the highest in the state of Louisiana, top 10 in Texas. It was a bigger state, more competition for like math, reading, science, and all that stuff. So I had like, pretty good grades.
Yeah.
My boarding school was a muse. This became a little bit of a story of lore, but like generally for boarding school, parents apply. I applied for myself and like went through the interviews by myself and like more or less decided to go by myself. And this was just like sight unseen, but I was like a bit precocious. I'm not that smart anymore. I kind of ran out of juice at 16. But back then I was really above the curve.
But hold on. But before you applied to the school, what was your childhood like? So like your parents were divorced, you had to move, you had a lot of responsibilities, the eldest in the family.
There's a lot of fun too, right? Like, so this is all like very, and I'm not doing a good job of painting, like there's like the beauty of like we were Christian and we were, we belonged to an evangelical church. So we spent a lot of time with our like church friends. We would be at their houses sometimes, there was like I'm not doing a good job of, we were not atomistically isolated. So like there was a lot of economic vulnerability. I don't want to undersell that, right? There were definitely, in retrospect, I thought about lots of things that happened where like, my mom was clearly skipping meals. I just didn't pick it up because we would eat and she's like, oh, I ate. But then I'm like, when I got older, I thought like, actually, I didn't see her eat for a long time. So she was definitely doing like one meal a day. She was working. When I was home for the summers, like I got jobs, worked, gave money to the family, that kind of thing. Like, even as September 11th happened right before our freshman year, but like the day September 11th happened, I was supposed to be flying into New York to go to my DOC trip on the 12th. Obviously that didn't happen. But the reason I mention that is like just 3 days before I had stopped working at Walmart for the summer. So like I had gotten a summer break of 3 days because I went straight from high school. I had a day off to myself. I came home and then I had graduated. I was valedictorian. It was great. And then I went from being valedictorian of my school in Pennsylvania. I went from being valedictorian to being a cashier in Walmart and cleaning pools and all sorts of things. So like this was our life. Like we worked. I mean, we studied, we read, we did a lot of reading to each other. There was a lot of radio theater, lots of fun community, lots of going to church. It was like a fun life in some ways. Yeah. But like people got jobs. Like as soon as you could work, you got a job because there was the only way like to keep the pot of money going. So
of course. So your academic standing and your inclination for reading and thinking and all that, does that run in the family? Do you see that with your siblings?
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely the family. And I mean, I think it helped. Like I said, there was a big disagreement between my mom and father about, are we going to be a part of the knowledge economy or are we going to be a part of the skilled trade economy? And luckily for me, I could I have made it to Dartmouth if I had been raised by my dad? Probably, I mean, my granddad was a pretty smart guy too, right? Like there was just a lot of smart people on my dad's side of the family. But I think that the idea of like seizing opportunity, of knowledge economy, of working, but also making sure that your free time was bettering yourself, that sense, because like in the trade side of my family, the idea was that you work and then you rest. Whereas on the knowledge and skill side of my family, the idea is you do something to earn money because you have to, but you're ultimately improving yourself so that one day you can earn money on your, like, you don't ask someone to pay you, you generate your own resources. Right?
Yeah.
And so that is just very like, and again, like some people would say, oh, your father's lazy. No, like he worked with his hands. He was tired. His body was tired. And so when he worked, he was exhausted. He sat down. Now, that doesn't mean my mom wasn't exhausted, but she just thought about that exhaustion differently. She wanted to say, a year from now, I don't want to be here, right? I want to have the opportunity to do something different. Now, that caused other problems for her when you're a woman of a certain age. And again, you heard this story through Ruth Bader Ginsburg. People told you what your opportunities were. Now, she happened to have a husband that really championed her, and she ended up on the Supreme Court. But women of a certain age, they don't get to make their careers just the way they wanted to. People told them what they could and couldn't do, right? And unfortunately, you know, my mother has been in a world where lots of people, like, that's why she's very into like owning her own stuff, being an independent contractor, working on her own terms. That's what she does now, because she just, every time she asked for a raise, every time she tried to bargain, she was either fired, punished, or like her job duties were cut because people were like, why do you think you know that's so much money? Or, you know, and this was something we were talking about, it still drives her crazy. She would hate that she would take courses, get degrees, know things, and she put it on her resume. And in places like Louisiana and Texas, people are like, you know, you don't have to steal someone's resume to get a job. And this would really piss off my mom. She's like, no, I do know calculus. Like, I did get this in math. Like, I did graduate in 3 years from college. Like, I'm not lying. This is my life. But people just, you know, they're like, are you sure? Are you sure?
Right.
And it would just drive her crazy, as you can imagine.
Yeah, it sounds like your mom and your dad definitely represented different philosophies. It's almost like your dad was consuming time, your mom was investing time. So they were both burning time, right? But one of them just burned it, and the time doesn't come back as any sort of value. Your mom was using it for some ways to prepare for a better future. So talk about the homelessness a little bit. What does that mean? What does home insecurity mean in reality?
Yeah, I mean, how many people you know you went to college with that were homeless, right? Like, it's not something we get to like talk about very often.
No, I don't know that many. Do you know that many actually?
So I do as you might know, as you may have guessed, homelessness and food security for families is actually like near and dear to my heart as causes that I actively donate to. I donate time. So I actually randomly know like a lot of formerly homeless people.
Yeah. Well, talk about your own. I'm really curious.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So like when people think homeless people, they usually think of like a smelly person or a loud person on the bus.
Yeah.
And that is one face. There are actually lots of people who are housing insecure that have mental issues for a variety of reasons. But a lot of housing insecurity, and this is actually something that's happening a lot whenever the economy gets bad. This was happening in the Great Recession. It's just people who can't afford to make rent payments. And so they're on people's couches. They live with friends. They live with family. And they don't live with one person forever, but they do sort of move from couch to couch. And for us, when we were going through our periods of homelessness, and we also lived in shelters, I'll get to that in just a second. But when we were going through our periods of homelessness, you know, there was actually a time where my mom actually moved into my dad's house. Now, this was, of course, a very awkward, by invitation.
Louisiana?
In Louisiana, by invitation, because we couldn't maintain our house. His house was a little bit bigger. And so, you know, we were living in his living room, basically. That was...
Wait, but you were in Pennsylvania at the time? So was your siblings and your mom living there?
Oh, no, this is the pre-Texas. So this was when I was younger.
Okay.
This is in my like 8 to 9, 10.
Okay.
So like my youngest sister's like 2 or 3. But we were all like living in the living room, you know, for like 5 or 6 months probably. I don't know. Like it was a while. It was longer than a week. It was shorter than 3 years, but it was some time. Time is weird when you're a kid, you know. But it was also super awkward because my dad had remarried. And so his current wife thought my mom was trying to get my dad back. And she's like, I don't want that, man. He's trash. So there was just a lot of that was happening. That was kind of funny, actually. Like as a kid, I was like, oh, look at all these people fighting for no reason. But like that was one of the things that housing insecurity looks like. We moved in with my mom's brother, my uncle, for a little while. We lived sort of with her mother, but that was a kind of weird situation because actually there was a lot of housing insecure people in that branch of the family. And so there are a lot of people living with my grandmother, but that's sort of what it looked like. It was some shelters, it was people's couches, that kind of thing.
Right.
Occasionally a church, for a week or two, a church.
Yeah. I mean, so you guys must not have had a lot of belonging. I mean, taking luggage from one
No,
place to another must have been real troublesome if you
it
had a
was,
lot.
yeah, it was off. I mean, it's good. I mean, I'm a minimalist now, right? Like, so.
Right. So how did you feel at the time having to move from place to place? Were you resentful? Were you unhappy? Did you get used to it really quickly? And how did your other siblings feel? Did you feel a responsibility to comfort them? Anything like that?
So here's the thing. I don't remember being resentful, but what I learned through therapy, apparently I was. So in my
You have a
20s and
therapist?
30s, apparently I did. Everyone should have a therapist. I really do think it's like a
Okay.
precondition for life.
Right.
Big on wellness. That's another thing I want to do as governor president is like really make sure people have access to those sorts of things. I don't remember being upset, but I do know, right, from just going to therapy that moving all the time, not having a sense of secure foundation. So this is different. Like I was not in any danger. I was not being beaten. I was not being malnourished, right? It was just not having a sense that things can be stable did for a long time make it extremely difficult for me to invest emotionally into anything because I thought everything would just go away, right? And so it kind of created this deep emotional distance in my personality, which of course like had all sorts of repercussions for like my dating life and things like that, but also just like how close I could get to friends, how close I get to work colleagues and these kinds of things. So, there's still repercussions that I live with, but I don't actively remember being like mad. I just think I developed a lot of coping mechanisms, which was like a numbing of the self, right? And that feels normal. I mean, I don't feel like I was tricked by my therapist. Those things seemed true, but I don't like in terms of like, do I actively remember being mad about anything? I do not, right? It was just like that was our life, and I didn't have another life to compare it to because again, like not everybody was housing insecure, but most of the people I knew growing up all experienced in different ways for different reasons deep economic vulnerability. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this was just our economic vulnerability.
Right. So how many years did you have to go through this moving from place to place sort of home insecurity situation?
Yeah, when I sat down and looked back in my mid 20s, I added up. It was a little less than 6 years, but not all at once. It was like a year or two here, a year or two
But this
there.
is all prior to Texas, right?
So this was generally all prior to Texas. There was a patch in Texas. This was certainly a job where my mom asked for a raise after she'd worked there for about 2.5 years. It was in the purchasing department, and that just didn't happen. She
Okay.
was basically told to train her replacement, and it was just very awkward. Um,
Right.
but that led to like a 6 or 7 month period that coincided because I was in boarding school, right? But it coincided when I was home for one summer. So the thing is to say, I believe if I think about it, my siblings have had a closer to, we're going to get into some territory stories I really don't talk about. My siblings have had closer to 9 years because of some other things that happened. And unfortunately, our alma mater does not factor well in this story. But me, I was like, I had a much more like stable life. Like once I was in boarding school, because I was in one place, and I would go home. And this is when you're like, what do people do? What are they in school? So like, my boarding school started in late September, but Texas starts its school year in early August because of the football season and all these sorts of things. So there'll be lots of times where I'm home, I'm trying to work, I'm still in high school, we're in a shelter, and so I had to go. So I've actually attended public school, even when I was in boarding school. I attended Texas public school, so I got some interesting insights into the world that where I would otherwise would not have gotten, because no one believed. They literally did not believe that I was in boarding school. Like I produced transcripts, they thought they were made up. Like no one would actually believe that I was in school when we were
But
living in a shelter one of the times I
John,
was
I'm a
home in
little
Texas.
confused. So this was during breaks when you were in the Pennsylvania private school, right? But because the
Yep.
private school starts later in September and the public schools in Texas start early in August, you would go and attend a public school during that 1 month gap?
Technically, it's like a 7 week gap, but yes, because
Seven
it's
week
like
gap.
very late in September,
But
and they
why did you
started
want to
like
do that?
I didn't want to. It's that like if you're thinking, so there's an actual, and this is something that we haven't really talked about. Like there's a deep, there's a way in which when you're poor, there's a lot of surveillance that occurs, and the assumption is that if you don't have housing, you're an irresponsible person. You're probably a drug addict or something. And so because I was one of my mother's children, they just assumed if I was not in school, it's because she couldn't figure out how to get me an education.
That's what you're saying.
Right?
So in order not to appear delinquent to the people
not
doing all the
just to appear
surveillance,
delinquent, we would have been thrown out of the homeless shelter.
the shelter.
If I wasn't, so it was
Can I ask you,
actually to prevent. Yeah.
What does the homeless shelter look like? What is it?
Bunk beds. It's like it turns out
It's like a hostel sort of thing.
It reminds me of the HH hostel in Chicago. It's actually, that's what it's a lot like. Although it's gender segregated. Yeah. I mean, that's the closest experience that anyone's probably had to it. It's not like a smelly, dirty place. It's just.
Right. But it does come with shower and bathrooms. But then you wouldn't be sharing the one room exclusively with your family members, right? There would be other people.
Once I turned 15, they didn't allow. So my younger brother, who was younger than me, he was fine. But the moment I turned 15, I wasn't allowed to be with the women and children anymore because I had to be with the men. Right.
Okay. So now I understand why you had to attend the public school as a result. I see. Okay. So then when you went there, they didn't believe.
Here's the gag. So they wouldn't accept this. They just didn't believe this place existed. Nobody believed it, nobody. And I was questioned by a lot of officers. People were just like, why is your mother lying? Why is she making up schools? They were just convinced she was on drugs because she was so pissed off.
What does the demographic look like in that area that you lived in and the public school that you attended? Was it a mostly black area? Was it a mixed area? Was it mostly white?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember. All of our teachers were white, but I don't remember. I've actually never thought about the demographics of that little high school. I remember some horror stories from it.
Did you not make friends though when you were going there for?
I did actually. I was actually very. I mean, and some of my friends. It wasn't an all black school. So I went to private school before I went to boarding school because of the whole at some point the whole public school thing in Louisiana became untenable. There's just only so many years you can accuse. My family was just tired of being threatened with legal action. So we ended up sending me to Catholic school for a variety of reasons. The Catholic school was 99% black. So it was black. Okay. So it was not that segregated. So the school I went to in Texas was less segregated. I remember Latino people, which I think was the first time I met Latino people. I remember white people. I remember black people. I don't remember any Asian people at the time. I didn't actually meet Asian people until I went to boarding school. We had a exchange program with Korea. But that's what I remember, but I can't tell you the proportions. I actually am surprised. I've actually never thought about it. I don't remember.
Wow. I mean, you just mentioned exchange program in Korea. I mean, this is such a diverse set of experiences.
I know you keep being I know this is going to be over, right? And I keep throwing little nuggets. That's why I'm giving to you a little bit of time because you're just John, I didn't even know. But I don't really tell. It's not that my story is complicated, but it's so many things aren't like other things, right? And this is one of the things that I tell people whenever I do a little motivational speaking. You can tell lots of stories about my life. There is a story where we can talk about deep economic deprivation. We can talk about the ways in which the economy and the feminization of poverty, particularly of families that are headed by, women of color. I experienced some of that. But I also was a valedictorian at a boarding school. I've gone to Dartmouth. I have a PhD from UChicago. You could tell that story too, right? You know what I mean? There's just so many, depending on what, but it's all true. And I think one of the reasons I'm getting into this and wanting to share this with your followers is there is a way in which some of the stories that we think about African-American families I've experienced. But there are also ways in which I have had some experiences that we don't associate with African-Americans. And I want to show how you're not just showing oh, you're an exception, but both things can be true at once. And it should force us to really think critically about how the people who happen to be poor are thought of and afforded opportunity and chance by the people who happen to not be poor, and whether or not we start taking people's poverty as proof that there's something wrong with them. Right. And I also really want to get into the you're oh, but don't people trust the public institutions? The history of my family, people just don't trust it. No one. And I mean, I have less skepticism than my mother, but my mother really believes that there was never anyone who treated her as if she wasn't lying about basic things. So why is your kid not in school? My kid is in school. Where? Philadelphia, boarding school. You're lying. You're crazy. What drug are you on? And I mean, and it's not. And it wasn't an improv joke. People seriously believed, and this is going to get to something that happened at Dartmouth. People seriously believed that she was off her medicine. like she doesn't take medicine. She's perfectly sane. But like people just believed she was making up something to hide the fact that her kid, that she was homeless, and they just assumed she was homeless, so she must not know what's going on, you know. And I think that that is something that I really want to bring forward for your listeners, because I think that sometimes we see these outcomes that come from economic vulnerability. We see outcomes that are happening because of the social and racial and economic segregation of our society, and we see the people who are in the throes of those outcomes, and there's a way in which we're like, you know, we're happy it's not us, but we're like, I wonder what they did wrong, right? And I mean, it's not like an active thing, but there's a kind of like, oh, what did they do wrong? You encounter someone in a homeless shelter and you don't think the cost of housing has outstripped their wages. You go, wonder what happened to them. Normal people live in houses. And so I just really want to just bring this out for your listeners, but also prosperity, that there could be lots of people who otherwise look as if they're poor, that are just not able to like maneuver through some very real glass ceilings, surveillance, and in some ways punishing logics that are embedded at all levels of US society, right?
Okay.
So I want to like continue on this for a little bit, because this Texas experience is actually, this Texas experience is really interesting, because on the one hand, I was like top of my class in boarding school. I know this cognitively. I was, at the time that I went, there's only a few students so because I didn't start at my boarding school in 7th grade, you basically have to be on the advanced math track to get to like calculus, AB, and like, you know, AP tests and stuff like that in school. So I was a year, quote, behind, because I came in 8th grade instead of 7th grade. So in order to make sure that I could take calculus, this was one of my big dreams of life, because I used to be a big nerd, I actually had to take there were several years where I had to take 2 math classes at once. And most people don't like math, so taking 2 at once was tremendously difficult. But like, you know, I loved my algebra 2 pre-calc days. I loved my trigonometry days.
You're talking about the Philly school right now, right?
Yeah, the Philly school. So
okay.
So it's important that I tell you this background, because of who my mother was, when I finally was forced. I mean, when I say forced, I mean basically the homeless shelter made it clear that if I wasn't going to be sent to public school, they were going to have to, because she wasn't following the rules, they were going to have to put her on the streets. So I'm like, I'll just go to school. It's not that big a deal. Like I was planning on earning money, but it's fine. I'll go to school, right?
Right.
We literally could not convince, I mean, I don't want to curse, we could not convince the people at that public school that I was intelligent. I was put into remedial math. Now, let me be clear. At my home high school, I'm in algebra 2. They would not allow me to even be in pre-algebra in the 9th grade. And I was in algebra 2 at the time. And it was because I came in from the homeless program, and we were trying to convince people that I in fact understood fractions, and they just wouldn't believe us, right? We could not get into the gifted program. And my mom was ready to fight. I'm like, I'm not gonna be here for 7 weeks, I don't care. But like the education that I got for those 7 weeks is disgusting. Like I was not only in a remedial math class, 3 of my courses were basically PE. And there were lots of people, I don't know if they were as smart as me, I don't know, I really don't know their story, right? But there were a lot of people who couldn't get into good programs, and most of their time in public school, they were literally just allowed to play. They weren't being taught anything. We were treated like idiots by our teachers. I ended up having to teach my friends how to like do basic division of fractions, because like the teacher wasn't helping them. And like, thank God I was there. But like, I couldn't imagine. Like, I was shocked, and I'm still kind of horrified to this day by the sort of 7 weeks that I experienced in the public Texas school, and how much more different my life would have been if I hadn't had the opportunity to take advanced math classes, right? And I mean, literally people fought us out, and I knew that I could do it because I was somewhere else. So like, one of the reasons I want to share that story is like, there are just all sorts of things that were wrong with that situation. And the surveillance and the not believing my mom was only one of them. What I was subjected to as a kid, and again, I chose not to fight. I'm only there for 7 weeks. It just wasn't worth my energy. But could you imagine if that was my only option? Right? Like, what if I hadn't had a full scholarship? What if we had not been able to pay for boarding school and I had been transferred to Texas?
This is when you were 15 now? 15, 16?
Yeah, 15. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's just, I just think, and I think that when I talk about the deep distrust of institutions, that's what I'm talking about. It's like these little low-level things. Like, you don't need to be shot or beaten. It's parents not being believed or not having ways to verify that children shouldn't be placed into remedial
they
math.
couldn't even give you a test or something so you can demonstrate your abilities?
Well, their whole thing is, so the thing is they were, it turns out, briefed by the, they were told, because I kind of came in and I wasn't on the roster, hey, this person's supposed to be here. There's a homeless lady who thinks her kid's going to some other school. They were basically briefed that like my family was delusional. And so when my mother was making the case, right? And again, it was like, I know it's actually kind of funny if you think about it.
Yeah,
but like,
yeah. They just thought it was a waste of time to
correct.
investigate further. They might as well just place you into this
where they thought I should be.
Class that doesn't teach. Yeah.
So I mean, like, yeah, it was it. And again, like, I don't think there are any villains in this story. In some ways, it's like a classic bureaucratic competence. But like that's the reality of what life was like. And like, so thank God I had another path. But could you like imagine how much different a person I could be if, because like, again, let's just say we were homeless, but I was still smart. Yeah. They wouldn't have any proof that my mother wasn't delusional because that's just what the assumptions that were built. And like, how does she escape that? There's no way to prove to someone you're not crazy except by getting a little crazier, right? And so I just really wanted to put that out there. So anyway, I know you have other questions, so we can move on.
Oh, I have too many other questions, but hold on. But at some point you mentioned something about our alma mater. What were you going to say about it?
Oh, so the other, yes.
You said something about how you and your siblings were something 9 years, and then this does not reflect well on our alma mater. I did not get that bit.
Yes, no, so I haven't told the story. So I just want to say I love Dartmouth, and I still give. So it's not, but there was a thing that happened. It was our sophomore year.
Yeah.
My mother had moved to Boston.
Right.
She was
sophomore year in college now.
Yep. Sophomore year of college. She had moved to Boston because, again, our family's very tight.
Okay.
It was not out of the ordinary for her to just randomly drive up on a Friday or Saturday night and like try to surprise me and say hello. Okay. There's actually a really funny story. I was walking one of my friends home who had been drinking, and it happened to be a lady, and my mom just like rolls by. I didn't expect her. The window's down, and she's like, "John Stevenson, where are you headed with that intoxicated woman?" Like in a very like, I did not raise you to be a rapist kind of voice.
Yeah.
So like, I was like, whoo. Yeah. Any case, there was one night where my mom had driven up to campus. I don't know where I was because I heard about this much later. And she had parked somewhere on campus, probably on Tuck Drive or something. I don't know. Any case, there was some kind of altercation with campus security. Okay. Between her and her car. My siblings are in her car, and she might have been having.
So your 3 other siblings are in the car. There are 4 people in the car.
Yep, there are 4 people in this car. They are trying to figure out what she's doing on campus. Right. And she's like, "My son goes here," and they're like, maybe. Any case, this basically gets out of hand. I wasn't there. This is the story I heard about. This gets out of hand, and Hanover police are called.
Okay.
They lock my mom up in jail for a few days. I don't think she had like some ID on her or something. It took her a while to prove who she was so they could contact me to verify that she was in fact related to me. Now here's the kicker. She is in jail, right? So again, jail is a place you go when you're not guilty of anything. They just hold you there. So you can just be put in jail. She's in jail. The thing is, she's now in jail for 3 days. I'm not notified until she can verify, because I don't know my mom's on campus. Right. And like we call, but like I had just talked to her earlier that day. And so like it was like a Sunday, and I was probably going to call her on a Wednesday. And when I called her on Wednesday, that's when things were like, I was like, "Where's mom? What's going on?" But here's the funny thing that happened between Sunday and Wednesday. She's in jail for 3 days. Now she's technically, right? Not only is she not cooperating with the police, there are now 3 minors that are unaccompanied. So they decided to, among other things, prosecute her, this is the gag, for not watching her children because she was in jail. And they
where were the kids when she was in jail?
They were collected by the police and put into foster homes. So I actually spent the last year and a half of Dartmouth trying to hunt down my siblings, which is a whole different story.
What? Are you serious?
I am not joking.
So okay, let me get this straight. So your mom took the kids, drove to Dartmouth to surprise you.
Because I mean, they're family, right? They're just coming to see me.
Yeah, they can see you. That's fine. Yeah. And then the cops locked her up, and because she was separated from the 3 siblings, 3 children, they were placed into foster care. You guys didn't know where they were.
Her kids, right? Under law,
And it took
She
you a year and a
abandoned
half
her kids.
to locate where they are.
Well, because I don't have, like, I didn't have access to their records. It's not like they gave me a forwarding number. And my mom was actually stuck in prison for a year because she didn't cooperate. And then they were prosecuting her for abandoning her kids for her whole argument, which she
Was she
ended up
not
winning
able to
against the
call
state of New
you the
Hampshire.
minute she was placed in the jail
No,
cell?
I didn't have a cell phone.
Oh, well,
This was in the era before cell phone.
Right, but
Like,
then how
they're
did you
not
guys
gonna-
get in touch with each other?
Well, because I started trying to track her down, and like there was an incident report. Like it took a little bit. I basically discovered like 4 or 5 days later, which caused a whole lot of shenanigans. But I discovered this like 4 or 5 days later. We were able to verify that I was in fact related to her. But that's when I was like, so where are my siblings? And that's when they were like, they've been taken to foster care, but because she had been technically charged with abandoning them. And under law, there are lots of people who abandon their kids that like want to come back to them. She was now a danger to the kids because under law, she had abandoned them. And so now she was being treated like a danger to the kids themselves. And I was not their guardian. So I didn't have any legal right to know their private information. They didn't have to turn that information over to me. This is how it all started, right? But again, this is all just like, you don't have to, nobody has to be a villain here. Just think about like how the law would work. Technically, if she's in jail for 3 days, all she has to do is be gone for 10 minutes. And then the police officer can jointly, which is what was written in the report. There was a car full of kids with no adult.
Right.
They were abandoned on Dartmouth campus. It was cold outside, right? They really talked about how cold it was, right? So that's what's in the police report, right? It was true. She wasn't there, right?
I mean, this is what in computer science we would call an edge case. Like people that wrote the law wouldn't have imagined such a combination of scenarios that would have led to such disastrous outcomes. So
part of what I'm trying to tell you is we have to really rethink about it. Is it an edge case? So if you think about it, right, people are using administrative law to contest desegregation, right? People are using administrative law to say, hey, I don't know if your kid is in fact in boarding school or not, right? These are all just people enforcing the rules. We actually have a lot of evidence, not just from Black Lives Matter, but from like dozens of like criminology. The police regularly use their description to like, you resist arrest. That's a made up crime. Like there are all sorts of things. So like people may not have imagined it, but the truth is like the police have the prerogative to make these kinds of claims. And they are regularly defended when people go, that's an edge case. We shouldn't do it this way. And the courts are like, hey, I don't think I should be getting into the business of deferring. We're going to defer to the police. Like this emerged into like qualified immunity. So I know there's a part of you that's like, this seems so unreasonable. But again, that is why lots of people don't trust public institutions. For most people, the normal operation of rules feels Kafkaesque. It feels authoritarian, and it feels like there is no recourse for any reasonable person to make sure that there are reasonable outcomes from laws.
Man, so talk about your process of tracking down your siblings. Were they all in one place? Were they in separate places? How did you find them?
They were in, so you got to help me with New Hampshire geography. I feel like it starts with an M. There was a city near us where it had a super
Manchester?
Walmart. It might have been Manchester. Was there another one? Was there another place where there was a super Walmart?
For Walmart? No, I don't know.
There is a city. It wasn't Manchester, but there's another city in New Hampshire. I went there and watched Star Wars. It has a big AMC theater and it has a super Walmart. And I just need to remember the name of it. In any case, they were in a foster home there. And by now my mom is out of jail, and we were able to all make contact because my sister Elizabeth was able to figure out something that was happening. She basically got old enough, because she was only 2 years older than me. She came to campus, we saw each other. She finally told me what was happening. She was with them. And technically, I think my mom is still a criminal in the state of New Hampshire. We basically just like kidnapped them and moved them to her house in Massachusetts. That's how this saga all ends. So they like all ran away from their foster homes technically.
Wait, and that took them a year and a half?
Well, we had to find each other, and my mom was also in prison for a year. She was in jail, so like this couldn't start until she got out of jail, and she had to get back to Massachusetts. She had to like establish a home. So it's not like the first day she got out of jail, there's like a house waiting for her. Like that's not how this works. So she had to like get a job. Like luckily.
Wait, but before she was in jail, she had some house, right? She was renting from somebody.
But like she's in jail, she's not working. Who's paying the rent?
Right, I understand. So then basically she got sort of evicted without her being there, right? So maybe all her furniture gets thrown onto the street, on the curb. And then she got out of the jail, and then she started locating your siblings, and then somehow
and then Elizabeth was the one who makes first contact that gets us all the information we need, and then we basically like
Elizabeth being your sister.
Yeah, the sister who's only 2 years younger than me.
Right. Okay. At the time, I guess she turned 17 then, because you're a sophomore, so that must have been 19, and then she was 2 years younger, therefore 17.
And that's why she got a little bit more freedom of movement.
Wow. Okay. And then she somehow got your other siblings out of their foster homes.
Yeah, so they all stayed together. So they got placed in a foster home together. They stayed. Like my sister, who had her own boarding school experience, but she didn't like it. But she basically was like the glue that held them together. This has actually caused a lot of resentment in the family because people were like, John was in college getting his fancy degree, but we were surviving. So this has also caused a lot of like family drama, as you can imagine, for different reasons. But I want to say we worked through it. We've mostly worked through it. We all talk to each other again. So, but
God,
it was an interesting thing.
I see. Okay. By the way, were you on a full ride with Dartmouth as well?
I was technically, yes.
I mean, it's just taking me some time to process this dichotomy between people's experiences and understanding the difference of experience between you and your siblings.
Yes, which is also an interesting. Yeah, and my mom and like the I mean, you said you wanted to get into the family history. I usually don't talk about it, but it was like, we're getting in there. Like, you know what I mean? I know it's not like, how do you run for president from this? But I'm like, I actually think my family history is like complicated enough that it's like worth, you know, giving you the opportunity to like chew and meditate on it. Because I don't know if you.
No, I'm very interested in it. I find it absolutely fascinating. And to be honest with you, I mean, we haven't talked that many times. Granted, each time we talk for a long time. Just by talking to you, I can't imagine you having had the sort of experience you describe, because you feel so much more calm and sane and unresentful, you know?
I think, yes, but it also helps that, I mean, despite student debt, I am solidly in the middle class. It has been a very long time since I was housing insecure. I've really gotten into the FIRE movement, financial responsibility. I have at least 4 months of income saved. You know what I mean? So like a lot of, besides the particular psychological stress and fallout that my family has to deal with from this experience, which is very real, very present, lots of resentment between siblings, set my brother on a really bad path. Like it was just a lot happened. So we're still living with that, but like I am not living the life that I grew up with, you know, full stop. So like it's easy for me to come across as normal because I am living a normal life now. Like I'm not housing insecure now, you know what I mean? So I think I might feel a little crazy if I was like housing insecure and couldn't keep a job, like I might feel a little crazy, you know? So I think it really helps. I'm not a Marxist, right? Because who is? Nobody, that's not even interesting. But like, I think it would be foolish of me, given my own experiences, like material preconditions. If my family if two people had married each other that shared a common vision, you know, 50% of marriages end in divorce. So this is not really their problem. Lots of people do it. How much different could life have been if they had shared the same vision? 2, how much different could life have been if my mother was able to experience a career and employment where she felt valued as an employee and had career progression and was being paid enough wages, right? Like who knows how much you should make, but maybe at least enough to cover the cost of living, right? How much different might our life have been? How much different might our lives be if at any given time where there was a chance where somebody was in power trying to decide whether they were going to listen to her or not, that she was taken seriously as a human being who was a reasonable person, capable of emotion and able to produce evidence, even if it was something that sounded like boarding school. What's that? Like it was outside of people's existence, but what if people had actually taken her seriously and given her the benefit of the doubt that she wasn't making things up? You know what I mean? So it's just all of these things. Like, of course I'm a reasonable person. Like I'm treated like I'm Dr. Stevenson. People walk in the room and tell me how brilliant I am now. That's fine. I just have a PhD. Sometimes it falls off my shelf and hits me on the head, but like, I'm just treated very differently. Like I'm not a woman. I don't have any kids, you know, so it's just easier for me to be calm because I don't have many of the stressors that, for instance, my forefathers and foremothers grew up with. And, you know, like, isn't everything perfect? No, but we have, and I have some horrifying work experiences, but on the whole, I am treated much better in the workplaces than any of my uncles, mother, father have ever been treated, partially because it's a slightly better place, but also partially because the world is more diverse. And now there's like a larger Black middle class, so that at the very least, there's like a professional network of people looking out for me. So like, it's just different in some ways. So it's very easy for me to be calm. I also like, Dartmouth is a great place to get an education. I met wonderful people who showed me, like, that's what I didn't have growing up. And it doesn't make Dartmouth like some kind of savior, but like, I actually met people who had very different experiences from me, who didn't grow up poor. Actually, most of the Black people I went to Dartmouth with were actually like African and Caribbean. It's not just Black people, I mean, all sorts of people. But like, these are folks who like vacationed in like the Caribbean islands I've still never made it to, by the way. Like, they vacation in places that I had not even heard of at the time, right? Like, it's just a completely different world. And for better or for worse, being at Dartmouth, then going to a place like UChicago, and it wasn't the education. I was exposed to different social networks, and I'm fortunate enough that I'm personable enough that those networks were able to like rub off on me, so that I was able to learn different ways of being, learn different ways of striving in this economy, and having a network where I can turn to people for opportunity and say, hey, I'm thinking about this career. I have a million people I can talk to. There are jobs in sectors of the economy my mom still hasn't heard of, not because she's not a smart person. She doesn't have peers who've ever done those things.
Right. So speaking of peers, tell me about your experience attending the private school and Dartmouth. So when you went there, that was probably the first time you've encountered peers, other students that have had very, very different experiences growing up. They're probably in the upper middle income echelon, and many of them were not Black, right? And you said you met your first Asian American friends there. So how did all that make you feel?
It was different. I mean, I actually like, so you want to talk about resentment? I think college was an interesting time, especially on racial identity. There were just so many, I grew up around Black people.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that the Black people I grew up around weren't all Black people. And
weren't all Black people?
Weren't all, like, all that is Black people was not exhausted by the people I grew up with. But like, what I grew up with, I thought was like Black culture, period. Capital B, capital C. But like, I met people from Africa, right, who like lived in the United States and thought of themselves as Black, and immigrants. That was just, I didn't know Black people could be immigrants for a long time. When you talk about immigrants, people meant Mexicans. Like, where I grew up, like, yeah, that's what immigrants meant Mexicans. Like, that's just what it meant. So like, the idea that there could be a Black person who thought of himself as an immigrant, like, that was deeply shocking. Not like in a bad way, but it was like, huh. And what counts as like Black food? That wasn't like widespread. So college was an interesting experience where even what I took for granted as my background got reshuffled, right? Like, I mean, there was a common experience I had with lots of people. Like, basically everybody at Dartmouth was a valedictorian. That's just the way things were. So like, we could talk about those kinds of things, but like, I felt very left out by how Blackness was defined at the time at Dartmouth. Not by anybody, just the common experiences people had were very different from my experiences. I just wasn't upper middle class, and a lot of people who went to school there were. And even in grad school was interesting because there's a lot of second and third generation academics, like grandchildren and children of academics. Right. But the people I got along best with were people, we were all first gens. Like, somebody was from the Army, another person was like just a surprise kid who grew up with a single mom. They were both white, but like, I ended up always bonding with people who like had a slightly less traditional background. But yeah, no, it was a very interesting experience of like understanding. But I think it really helped me because I learned that, a lot of what I was taught, like, you work hard, you get a good education. Turns out these are classic narratives from like immigrant families. So I had a lot of friends who were like immigrants that like, oh yeah, my mom told me the same thing. So I actually discovered a lot of commonality with people that I didn't know I had things in common with. So it was a wonderful time. I think it's made me a much better person in the sense of like, I don't take for granted that if I look at someone, I don't just assume they're like or not like me. I let that get revealed by the conversation, by their attitude, by their heart, by their practices of wellness. And I think Dartmouth really helped me do that.
Okay. So let's go back to the political segment of our interview today. I think I fully comprehend where you are coming from in terms of why you want to enter into politics. But maybe let's now talk a little bit about how, because you're currently not a public servant, but you want to become one. And I know that you've made elaborate plans to get to where you want to be. So maybe tell us a little bit about that plan.
It's not too much of a master plan, but it is relatively simple. In order to run for any office, you have to achieve political residency, which is a number of years you have to live in a place. And I realized that a lot of the issues that I care most about, hospitals, transportation policy, these are really done at the local level and often and particularly jails and jail construction and prisons and all that stuff. These are done at the state level and the local level. And in order to have that deep sense, but also I'm not like, just because I've had a certain set of experiences and been able to like study a certain set of things and believe in data, does not believe that I'm any better than anybody else who I like lived and grew up with. So the beauty of the political residency is I get to move to a jurisdiction and learn about the issues that community faces, learn about how to talk about my own experiences in ways that other people understand, but more specifically learn how people who live here like talk about their own world. Like, how do they think about their problems? And how can we move them, how can we meet these challenges in a way that make institutions stronger and more accountable to people so that you're not getting these, like what you call corner cases, not corner cases, that's not the word you use, edge case. So you're not getting these edge cases, right? So that's so the how, number one was I had to pick a jurisdiction and move, right? And I chose Maryland. We can get into that for a while in a second. The second thing for me, I just know that I'm not able to focus on things as long as I owe people money. And, for a variety of reasons, grad school, I was able to take out a lot of graduate school debt, which is being retired. It's within a few months of being able to go away. And I'm so happy. So for me, the second thing was like achieve a measure of financial independence.
I have a question. Your PhD from Chicago, that was in statistics, right?
Political science, technically.
Political science, right.
A lot of political science is stats. So I did a lot of stats in my dissertation, but it was technically in the political science department.
Right. So I'm not aware of PhD programs where they make the students rack up debt. So how did that work for you?
There was a disagreement with my advisor that added about 3 years to my journey. And the 3 years to my journey did not coincide with my funding cycle. So their base funding cycle is like 4 years. And unfortunately, like I lost some support of the advisor for a variety of reasons that are specific to UChicago, and I will happily trash UChicago one day, but we will, okay. I mean, I love that school, but we can get into like grad school and the like politics of grad school, not today, not just because I know there's some stuff you actually want to ask me about, but the politics of grad school and why no one should go to grad school, basically, I'm more than happy to do a second, third, fourth, and fifth interview about. But this is just to say there was another type of vulnerability that I was subject to, and I was just going to leave grad school, which was very common. Actually, Black people did not graduate from UChicago political science department. They just all dropped out. Like it just happened for like 14 years. And it was going to happen to me for a variety of reasons too. But I was trying to change careers and starting nonprofit organizations and doing sorts of fun stuff. And I realized that when people heard that I was in grad school getting a PhD, same ideas, they would treat me better. And so that it was given I had put enough time in and I was going to be able to finish, I just needed to figure out my own project plan. I was like, I have come much further than most people to getting a degree, and my life will be much better off if I am able to certify, I have something that proves that I know things. And so unfortunately, when I went back, so to speak, that there was not as much funding as there should have been for a variety of reasons. And so I had to finance that on debt, which I'm not totally mad about, but I'm kind of mad about.
Okay. All right. Got it. Anyway, so talk about your political plan.
Yes. And so, part one, jurisdiction. Part two, financial independence. Jurisdiction. Two, more community involvement. Part three, and there's a fourth part. Part three is financial independence. For a variety of reasons, I just think for me, I will feel very comfortable not owing anyone anything. And like running for office, we're not rich. It's very time consuming. And so if I can get my operational costs lower than my income, especially my passive income. I don't need to live well, but that frees me to like really engage in public service and do the things I need to do to win a campaign. The last thing, of course, was that I needed to do something in the private sector. So I know that it's like everyone's like, there's something wrong with the private sector, there's something wrong with the private sector, or there's something wrong with the public sector. People just want to choose sides. I think that the ability to organize, the ability to command an organization, the ability to think about efficiencies, and more specifically for me about, and we talked about this already, making decisions using data and metrics. I think business is a great place to learn that. It's not the only place, but I just think it's a ruthless place. And I'm not one of these people that's like run a government like a business. I think that's obnoxious. You're not trying to make a profit. But I do believe the idea of setting up standard processes, being able to think about workflows, making sure you're getting the best people, making sure that your organization has focus, making sure those focuses are measurable and trackable. These are all things that for me, I could really find in the private sector. And honestly, the private sector is where a lot of people experience America. Like a lot of our citizenship is experienced as W-2 employees. And so I think the ability to create my own corporate culture, especially if I want to like help reform the economy, if I hadn't ever participated in it at the small sector, why do I think I know something about the big? So for me, it was just like being able to have that experience.
Okay, got it. So where are you on this roadmap right now?
So I am. So it takes 7 years, I believe, to qualify to be the governor of Maryland, and I am on year 3. I think it's 4 years to be able to enter Baltimore politics, but I'm probably going to be working for another 2.5 years or 3 years. I mean, there's some ways that this might get interrupted. Like there are ways like if the Democrats sweep power, like the things that they should do, and I might like step out of work to go be like, you need to add 4 states to the Senate. Like you got to do it. If you don't do it, you're never going to be in a Senate majority again. So like if I have to leave work to like go tell people to do the right thing, I will certainly do that. But I'm hoping to just like be on the sidelines, retire my debt, learn a lot about the private economy, connect to a community, and then run more or less unblemished by a political system.
Well, how did you decide to be in Maryland instead of another state?
So Maryland so there's a couple things. One is that not many states elect Black governors. There are enough Black people here that you could do it, though technically none of the Black people who've run the last 2 cycles have beat the lieutenant governor and Ben Jealous both failed, but there's enough residual base. 2, it had to be, I would have preferred a state that was more demographically similar to the United States, but I believe that for a variety of reasons, Maryland is a richer place. It has a higher per capita income, and some of the reforms that I want to do of like education, of police, they could be done here in Maryland and as a blueprint to send to other states. And the last thing is, though maybe the Maryland legislature will take this away at some point, the Maryland governor is actually quite powerful. It's 2 powers that I'm very interested in. The first is the line item veto, which actually the Supreme Court ruled was unconstitutional for the President of the United States. Bill Clinton was the last president that had it.
Right.
That is a very, there's actually an amendment out right now we're supposed to be voting on whether the legislature can get some power over that. And I'm torn about that. But like the governor can just defund things. Now, the current governor has defunded things that I care about, like transportation. But like, I think the ability, it just gives you a much stronger negotiating position in the budget cycle. If you're like, there are some things we're not going to be adding any more money to, and you can't stop me. So you need to negotiate with me about what we're going to do to replace it. I'm really excited about that. The last thing, and not a lot of people know this, and this is just really getting into the weeds. The governor, so Baltimore is a very interesting place. It's one of the few cities that's not in a county. It's actually like cut off strategically, actually, if you kind of look at the legislative history, it's cut off from a lot of Maryland. It's actually one of the many reasons that Baltimore as a city institution has a lot of poor outcomes. In addition, its police department is run by the Maryland governorship. The city has the ability to appoint the police chief, but the actual department is run by the Maryland governor. The Baltimore police are some of the most deadly, irresponsible, crooked police in the United States. Of course, not as bad as the NYPD for a variety of reasons, but they're bad. Like, I mean, obviously there's some good apples, but they're also like the largest source of organized crime. Like they run drugs, like and this isn't me making stuff up. This is like in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Baltimore Police Department is bad news. They're run by the governor. They're not controlled by the city. And if I have some ideas about making an accountable police force. The office of the governor of Maryland will allow me to do so in one of the most broken police institutions in the United States. And I think that it would really allow me to help shape change for good on a variety of levels. So that is why Maryland was here and chosen.
Okay. You also mentioned earlier, maybe it was a Freudian slip, something about running for president at some point. Is that on your plan or on your radar as well?
Well, yeah, you gotta, I mean, everybody thinks they can be president, right? Or at least there's the joke that there's 150 people who think they should be president. They're all senators and governors.
Right.
It could be the case that I'm absolutely completely wrong about public institutions and that all the investments I want to make will be wrong. Let me have a successful governorship and then maybe I'll run for president.
Okay.
But I really care about that. I mean, I have a lot of foreign policy ideas, but I can just be Secretary of State in something, you know. I'm going to try to be governor first.
Okay, so race is in the spotlight in our media, social media, our normal discourse, to say the least. And so maybe from your vantage point, tell us about your understanding and thoughts on Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-fascist movement, so BLM and Antifa.
Yes, so let's start in reverse order. I assume everyone is an anti-fascist. Like, who wants a fascist government? I'm one of these people where I'm like, Antifa is barely organized. They're like barely interesting. I don't know if you know this, but when I was at the University of Maryland as a research professor, I was able to co-create a database called PIRUS, which is profiles of individuals radicalized in the United States. And one of the things that we really found is that left-wing violence, extremist violence, hasn't been a thing since the 60s. Even sort of what we call Islamic violence isn't really a thing. It's almost all domestic right-wing and or white nationalist groups, primarily in places like Eastern Oregon, Western Kentucky, these kinds of places. They are Stormfront, all that nonsense. That's where the danger is coming from empirically. We validate it with statistics, like we have a whole report on it.
Yeah, I read an article about this actually. I think it's from some website called arce.org, something like that.
Yeah.
Is this related to that?
Yeah, this is related. So we like put out the database and then people combed through it. It was great. It was fun. And like one of the reasons it took so long is I was part of the team that really made sure we had validated data, because there were some early versions of the database where I'm like, you know, there's a lot of missing data. We can't make those claims. So it actually got much better and was great. And we did a lot of mixed methods. But I mentioned this to say that, like, I don't want to I'm not just making stuff up here. Although I haven't obviously looked since 2019, but like the empirical evidence is clear. Antifa and these left-wing movements are not engaging in that much violence, if any at all. It's just not, I mean, like we can't find it. It's just not there. So when people are like, what do you think about Antifa? I was like, what do you think of vanilla ice cream? Like, they're boring. You know what I mean? Like, they're not even interesting because they're not doing anything. They're only, the head of state wants to make them controversial, but they're not interesting. Like, and I feel bad. I mean, of course we're all anti-fascist, but like, they're not doing anything interesting.
Okay. Before we move on to BLM though, about Antifa. So I have a couple of questions. So number one is, when you put together that database, when you discuss violence, does that include property damage? Like if you were to blow up a building, for example, or were you to, let's say, go in some store and loot some things, does that get included in the database?
It does. Much to my chagrin, because I actually don't think conceptually property damage, like if you model, we technically call it contentious politics. If you model contentious politics, episodes that result in human casualties have a very different statistical logic than episodes that hurt buildings for a variety of reasons. But because it was a government-funded project, people in the government, particularly the customers we were building it for, believe that blowing up a building is like shooting a person in the face. So it is all included in there. Okay.
And then my second question is, it just seems that there's a lot more coverage of left-wing protests gone from being peaceful to being non-peaceful. And there's a lot of mockery of this something is mostly peaceful language on social media, meaning that it just seems that what's occupying our mind share is more of these left-wing protests that have become violent, at least as of late, versus these right-wing violent activities, right? So when you mentioned your finding of right-wing activities being more of the norm than left-wing, it just seems that, at least to me, from what I've been reading in newspapers, it doesn't seem to jive. And I read, a full spectrum of different viewpoints.
Yeah, no, so there's a couple things happening, right? And like, I want to take it apart. This is great. This is like one of my favorite hobby horses. So the first thing is that if you're thinking about it empirically, right? Like, just think about the numbers. Every protest would be a row, right, in a database, right? Every instance of a protest. And you could even get it down to, and this is how we model it as an event, every day that there's a protest is a row. So if you started thinking about all the protests, all the geographies expanding over time, maybe, and this has been going on for a while, less than 1% of those rows include violence. And let's just say the event was whether or not there was property damage or not. Just that was it. We're not even talking about who's doing it. Empirically, people are covering it, but when you actually think about an event as something that happens day by day and would be populated in a database, the vast majority of rows do not have check yes or the one or whatever you want to do to say that there was violence that day. I mean, that's just the truth. Because if there was that much damage happening, you would have heard about it. Okay, like, that's just the thing. And so that's number one. Number two, peaceful protests. Now, this is going to sound crazy, and I promise I'm going to get you somewhere that this makes sense. You can have a peaceful protest in which there are also episodes of property damage, and that protest can be peaceful. Now, you might be like, how does that work, John? And I promise you it doesn't work. I'm not the head of state. I'm not just making stuff up. This isn't alternative facts. The assumption that a lot of people make, and again, this is just not true. It's not true in the United States. It's not true in protests in Nigeria. It's not true when you look at protests in Eastern Europe. A protest going on, even if you see episodes of what we might want to call property damage, does not mean that the people who started the protest are the same groups or people who caused the property damage. And one of the key features of right-wing groups in the United States is that they use any sort of contentious politics, uprising, anarchy as an excuse to move closer and closer to their kind of anarchist version of libertarianism, which is bust up buildings, knock out the police, break up police cars. And so when you actually see, like, if you look at the level of initiator, if you look at the actors who are organizing the movement for Black Lives protests are not the same actors who are looting banks. In fact, these are often not even people associated with the movements. They come in, they show up, and they're causing a ruckus. Now, the media doesn't want to tell you about those stories, but they, in the sense of when the media covers it, they just talk about an event occurred, there was property damage during the event. They don't do a really good job of saying, and here's who caused the property damage and why. They're just like, oh, if people were protesting peacefully, no buildings would be broken. But we actually have a lot of evidence that the protesters are restraining themselves. The third issue is there are some instances of protesters engaging in property damage and violence, since particularly in this latest episode. And again, they track very similarly to how political violence looks around the world. Most of the violence that we've seen from protesters has occurred after and in response to the escalation of force by state security forces. So the police came out here looking like a military, gassing people, gassing journalists, beating people up. This was all caught on film. I'm actually not exaggerating. You know, it was a very awkward May through July. That is when we saw protesters fighting back. Now, again, this is the reason I mention this is if you look at this cross-nationally, particularly in things that have happened since the 1980s, it was a little different during decolonization, but when things that have happened in the 1980s, the rare instances where you see protesters using violence are often in response to security forces gone wild, period. So I have not seen any evidence that doesn't track with that general understanding that has been true for about 30 years of what political protests and so-called violence looks like around the world. And I'm not seeing a lot of evidence that that pattern has been broken.
Got it. Okay. This is eye-opening for me. So
yeah, this was my life for a while. This is what I studied.
Right. Why don't we also move forward to your view on BLM?
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry. So yeah, I know you're digesting. You're like, this contrarian. Yeah. So I support support BLM for a variety of reasons. If you think about the main thrust of what the movement for Black Lives is about, it is that every person who exists in a country, irrespective of their citizen status, should not be terrorized or preyed upon by state institutions. That the parts of the state that use violence should be accountable to public oversight.
Sure.
And that economic vulnerability and or social vulnerability, though it's mostly economic, forms of vulnerability should not lead to patterns of life that are just worse off, whether they're health outcomes, whether they are criminalization, like all of these sorts of things. There is a segment of Black Lives Matters, which I also agree with, which is that we should completely rethink how we understand what is criminal and what punishment looks like, right? But I understand that is much more controversial, but like those other parts of Black Lives Matter are actually things that people affirm. Now, it has become controversial, quote unquote, because a lot of people want to go, oh, but do only Black Lives Matter? But no Black Lives Matter person has ever said Black Lives only matter, right? It is that no one has ever made the claim that Black lives should only matter. No one has ever made the claim that Black lives should matter more. The claim is that they should not matter less. And Black here, I think, really, I mean, it is a movement about Black people, but it stands in for choose your segment of society. People should have equal dignity under the law. And there's also a critique that the law is monstrous, but let's bracket that for a second. People should have equal dignity under the law, and every individual should be treated with equal concern and respect. In some ways, that's not really controversial, and I think any reasonable reading of the movement, that's what the movement is talking about.
I totally agree. So I actually don't think sane people would argue against the slogan Black Lives Matter, clearly, right?
Lots of people say it's racist.
Even the slogan itself?
Yeah. So there is a version, and it's kind of a clever troll version, but the idea, some people say that if you mention race, you're a racist. It's none of the people fighting for racial justice.
Right?
Yeah, it's nonsensical.
Right. I mean, lots of things can be race related and not be racist. I mean,
that is correct.
So, but I think there's one segment of the principles being put forward by the capital BLM movement. It was originally on their website, and I think that actually has been since
they
been
actually have like
down.
a whole list of demands. Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
but
did they take them down?
They took them down. Yeah. I don't know if it's been reinstated, but one of those segments was something like the traditional family structure, the nucleus family structure needs to be disrupted. So something about how I think the founders of the movement or whoever put forth these tenets did not agree that a father-mother structure was the optimal way of raising children, which I don't know if is an argument for a disruption to an innovative way of raising kids, or is just a admission to the current plight of lots of Black families and admitting that as just thinking of that as the norm rather than condemning that as the reason why a lot of Blacks are not living in optimal economic situations.
Yeah, that's an interesting. So let me come at this orthogonally, right? So just because I do know some of the theorists of the BLM movement, there's a couple of ways that you can take that statement, and I think you took it one way, but a different way to think about what the disruption might mean is people think of families as natural, but families also exist in the legal order. And we have a set of institutions in the United States, particularly a set of redistributive institutions that reward people who have differentially two people of different genders, bonded by marriage, living in the same household, raising children. That is the preferred family type by the legal order. This has a couple of problems with it, and I think this is what Black Lives Matter is trying to get at. One, that particular model of family is only one model of family, right? What if people were the same gender, right? I mean, this is part of the marriage equality movement issue, right? So sorry, there's sort of three levels. One is there's some people who believe that the state should not have anything to do with the family order. I think that's nonsense. I think it's important for I think it's important for the state to make sure that there are more humans in the world. So but I do want to acknowledge that there's that critique. I'm just not agreeing with it. So I'm one of those people who thinks it's okay for the state to be involved in saying to promote family order. I agree with Black Lives Matter, though, that you need a more pluralistic vision of what that is. So for instance, let's just take it apart piece by piece. There are lots of families in which there are more adults than, and not all of them are married, and they're not all polygamous. There could be multiple generations of people who are trying to take care of a certain set of minors. That's not rewarded or any way recognized under law. There are lots of families that don't have children. There is a penalty for them in the tax code. That's not rewarded in law. There are a lot of families that don't have two people of a different gender. That is in some ways not rewarded and certainly under threat if a new justice is elected. And then, of course, there are families in which there are more minors than there are adults, and often are single head households. And I think that part of what Black Lives Matter is getting at is, sure, right, assuming that we want to have the constitutional structure promoting one type of family, that's fine, but there should be a pluralism of types of family structures that are supported by the political order that match a little bit of the variety of family structures that we find in the actual world. And I don't think that's controversial. I see you might disagree, and that's okay, but I just want to say I think that's not the craziest thing I've heard today.
Okay. No, I'm not sure if I agree or disagree. I'm just taking time to process that information. I never thought about it this way before. Okay.
That's why they messed up and gave me a PhD.
No. I think it's very well deserved. So, John, I only have one last question for you. So, I have an inkling that if you are going to vote for the president, in November, you're probably going Democrat instead of Republican. So what are some ways you would empathize with Trump supporters at this point?
Yeah, I actually have a lot of empathy for everybody. And this is not a dodge. This is that if people honestly believe that the incumbent has executed his duties well, that as a head of government, he has run a competent government, and that as a head of state, he has represented the United States in its interests well, then yeah, you should totally be voting for him, right? I don't believe I can answer those questions in the affirmative, but I'm not, I just in the same way,
Yeah. So as a Black person, I'm sure you are aware of some Black people that are Trump supporters. Yeah. Some might be your friends, maybe your associates. Some are more in the public sphere, people that you know about, right? So maybe the best thing to do is to think of a few examples, and I'd love to get your take on why they would lean that way. Actually trying to think of somebody. Like, for example, Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina or North Carolina?
He's South Carolina.
South Carolina. And he actually went on RNC. And I didn't listen to his speech. I assumed that he supported the president and vocally. And, he had an interesting upbringing. If I remember correctly, he also came from a single parent household. And he basically was a rags to middle class story. He eventually owned his own insurance agency. He became a conservative because he had some kind of mentor that showed him the conservative ways and so on and so forth. And he finally got to where he was. Now, I don't know the complete reasoning for why he would back Donald Trump. And I personally do not necessarily think that Donald Trump intrinsically is very much on the side of non-whites. I see him very much in the white nationalist category and reluctantly helping people that are not in that particular camp, right? He's not the sort of conservative that's after ideas and not skin color, right? I think it's very much in the latter category. So what do you think are the reasons, good faith ones, why some of your Black brothers and sisters would support somebody like Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So a couple of things. So I'll start with, because in the long ago I was Republican. It's been like 30 years, but it's been a while. It's been a minute.
Wait, who was Republican?
Me.
Oh, you were a Republican before?
Yeah, when I got to Dartmouth, I was Republican. I'm not going to let you get distracted though. I know you want to ask follow-up questions. See,
Right.
I'm going to keep throwing. You're going to.
Right. Okay.
But there's a couple. So there's a thing, and I actually think, and this is same thing with Justice Thomas. A lot of people who experience poverty, and it's not just Black. I actually think there are a lot of white people and non-white people.
Clarence Thomas?
You're
talking about Clarence
Thomas on the the justice on the Supreme Court.
Right.
There's a way in which the ability to sacrifice, the ability to have discipline, the ability to have good character and grit, these are classic sort of small c conservative values. And there is a version of the Republican Party where those things are celebrated. Not as much anymore. The words we used to use, and the Democrats have tried to co-opt this actually, particularly under Clinton and Obama, personal responsibility. The Republican Party still has a little bit more brand about personal responsibility. And a lot of people who were formerly poor, because there aren't a lot of like poor senators, but a lot of people who were formerly poor really believe that this kind of grit, nose to the grindstone sense of like
bootstraps.
No, I don't quite want to use the bootstraps language because that's in a certain way that can be very dismissive, but I think there is a bootstrap mentality. But it's like small c conservative of you worked hard and you were. It's not meritocratic. It's you worked hard and you are rewarded with the blessings of the fact that you did what you were supposed to do. It's a little bit more like the ant and the grasshopper, right? The liberal version of the story is the meritocracy. The smart people are rewarded because they worked hard, they got smart. But the sort of more small c and I actually think that there are a lot of formerly poor small c conservatives who believe that character determines things. So that's one. There's another good faith Republican argument, more or less good faith. I think it has some ominous implications, but I think there's a good faith that there's a core to American culture that happens to be associated with a Protestant version of Christianity, the general legal culture that emerged from the British settlers, although they were a small minority. There were a lot of other people here, including other white people, but like general British English love of institutions, respect for limited government. There's this core that the United States gives to the world order. In fact, a lot of these folks are the people that are like scared of China because China doesn't have those good values. They're not Protestants, for instance. They didn't come from Britain. They're going to ruin us with their atheism or something. There's this idea, and this is actually left over from the Reagan coalition. This was actually the deep anti-communist coalition because the communists were godless. There's this idea that there's like a core of American culture that makes us great and that makes people who affirm that culture great. And that culture with its like weird, like Democrats hate that culture because they're like multicultural, they're letting in every immigrant they can find, they don't love God, they don't think America's exceptional. So there's a lot of people who actually agree with that. There are some good faith arguments that if you believe that you are in or going to soon be in the top 10% of income earners or asset earners in the United States, your tax outcomes, personally keeping money, will do better under Republicans than they do under Democrats. It's just true. Everybody's lowering taxes, but the Republicans are gutting them like fishes. Now, some of the people who are like frothing at the mouth about tax increases are only making $60,000 a year. Not sure what taxes they're paying, but it's fine. There are some really rich people who are doing quite well for themselves. So I think there's and there are some people, and I think this is, I don't want to call them pro-life. They're actually anti-abortion because I think it's weird to be pro-life if you lock people up in cages and separate kids at the border. But there are a lot of people who are anti-abortion, and the Democrats are not anti-abortion. And there are some people who deeply care about it. They're the Catholics who support the death penalty. I don't get it because the Catholic Church is against abortion and the death penalty. But there are a lot of people who are Catholic and hate abortion, but they don't say anything about the death penalty or police killing folks. That's fine. I'm not here to judge anybody. But I think there's a good faith argument that there are some deeply anti-abortion folks who also find an ally in an administration that has prioritized making sure that the judges and justices of the courts of the United States are committed anti-abortionists. So I think those are the only reasonable good faith arguments that people can make.
Okay, it almost sounds like you're saying two things. Number one is their support for Donald Trump very much emanates from their support for the Republican Party. And
Correct.
the Republican Party still has a certain segment of it that represents those values that you mentioned. And the second thing that you were saying is something along the lines of people just being one issue voter, if you will, right? So they're just...
And they're one issue voters on the Democratic side.
Right. Strictly pro-life
yeah.
or anti-abortion in your phraseology, such that they would only support the president that backs that position.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wait, but how does this intersect with Black people, though? My question is...
See, this is the thing, is I actually think there are lots of, there are some Black people. Most of the Black people who support the president are folks who basically are like, I have the character and the grit, I'm a good American. So if you hear what Lindsey Graham says about Senator Scott, he's like, we get along with Black people fine. They just have to accept our conservative values or we run them out of town. People who deeply buy into this sort of thick idea of American culture, there are lots of Black people who buy into that. There's a whole segment. There's actually we could have had a whole segment on this. If you're into polling and you're into academia, there's actually about 5 to 7, depending on how you measure them, but it's usually about 6 different political ideologies in the Black community, just looking at Black people. And one of them is Black conservatism. Another one is Black nationalism, which a lot of Black nationalists tend to be Republican. For a long time, Louis Farrakhan, for instance, was a Republican. So
I did not know that. And by the way, what is a Black nationalist? I never heard of that.
There are Black nationalists. I'm more than
that's
happy
like Malcolm X sort of thing?
Yeah, Malcolm X was a Black nationalist. Right. Some people would argue Marcus Garvey, but they're strands. But the justice to get into what that looks like, it takes a little longer than a few minutes, but I'm happy to have a follow-up interview about that. But there are more, you just see a lot of Black Democrats, but they're actually very different cultural theories inside the Black community and different political ideologies. And a lot of people don't see that because if you look at partisan voting behavior, you don't see the sort of ways in which coalitions break apart and come together. Similarly, there are lots of different sort of ideologies within the Republican Party and within the Democratic Party. Donald Trump is trying to, as you say, or not, the head of state, the 45th president, is trying to make it a racial story. Because if you can make it a racial story, there's still enough white people that if 80 to 90% of white people vote for the Republican Party, the Republicans win. That's the Mississippi, Alabama story. There's huge racial polarization there. That's why you can have large Black populations that have no share of the vote and are dominated by their local institutions, as we were talking about earlier. However, if you can have white people have as much political variety as they currently do, you only need 39 to 42% of white folks to vote for the Democratic Party because the Democrats get such a high share of non-white voters, right? And that's what, if you're thinking about the Republican strategy, they're trying to drive the Democrats' share of the white vote into the low 20s and restrict how many non-whites can vote with ease.
Understandable. Well, the election day is coming up soon. I hope you either mailed in or you are bringing a folding chair to vote in line. But John, it's been fascinating conversation today. Thanks for dropping by. And I hope you stay the course with your gubernatorial ambitions. And I look forward to the day when you participate in that process formally. Yeah, and don't worry, I'll hit you up for a donation. Will do. Sounds good. Well, thanks a lot, John. This has been great. Thank you. Yeah. I'll look forward to having you back at some point to explain some of the other things. Yeah. To dive deeper on some of these other rabbit holes you've thrown me. I'll have to interview you at some point because I actually do want to hear a lot about your views on finance. And then, you've run the Chinatown 2.0 podcast. So I think you probably have a lot to say about sort of trans-border identities. So one day I'll return the favor. All right. Cool. Thanks. All right, John. Thanks a lot. Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.